October 31st, 1863. On that autumn day in San Saba County, Texas, Thomas Edward Ketchum entered a crowded log house near China Creek, the youngest child in a family already worn down by hard work, risk, and the constant need to hold on to every acre they could keep. The Ketchum place sat in the rolling uplands where China Creek ran toward the San Saba River, in country of clay and sandy loam, live oak, mesquite, and cedar. The house was rough timber and chink, with a lean kitchen shed and a low barn close enough that a lantern could send a thin glow across the packed dirt yard. Inside lived Greenberry Ketchum and his wife, Temperance Catherine, with a cluster of older sons and daughters and now one more infant to feed. Greenberry had come south from Illinois, where he had served as a coroner, and by the early 1860s he held land, stock, and personal property worth several $1,000s. Every dollar came from cattle, crops, and the willingness of his family to work from dawn until after dark. Life along Richland Creek already carried a history of fear and violence. In the years before Tom's birth, Indian raids had driven settlers to gather at fortified spots near San Saba. Old stories about families forting up, about rifles stacked by doors and horses driven into pens at night, were repeated across supper tables and at Sunday gatherings. The war between North and South now raged far away, yet it pulled men, money, and attention eastward, and left frontier families like the Ketchums to guard themselves. Rangers rode out of a small station at the head of Richland Creek, and their passing horses' dust and carbines were part of the world Tom opened his eyes into, even if he was too small to remember those early patrols. The Ketchum homestead was crowded from the start for him. Older brothers and sisters already knew how to harness a team, swing an axe, or keep a fire going through a cold night. Sam, nearly 10 years older, moved with the self-assurance of a boy who had already shouldered a rifle and ridden fence lines. Barry, the eldest surviving son, carried himself like a man rather than a youth, because everyone around him expected that he would one day control the land and the stock. Tom's place was near the hearth and underfoot, listening while the older ones spoke and absorbing the rhythm of that hard household long before he understood words like foreclosure, drought, or debt. Daily life shaped him as much as family names. Morning meant the scrape of chair legs, the smell of smoke and coffee, and the shuffle of boots across punishingly uneven floors. Water came in buckets from the creek or from a shallow well. Wood had to be split and stacked, or the small cabin would go cold in winter. The older Ketchum boys rode out to check cattle, mend stretches of rail fence, or cut brush from draws before snakes and hogs thickened there. The girls cooked, washed, carded wool, and sewed, then went into the fields when more hands were needed. As soon as Tom could carry a small armload of wood or lead a haltered calf, chores became his language. There was no corner of the place that did not demand effort from someone. In those early years, his father still gave the place a firm center. Greenberry spoke with neighbors about brands, landlines, taxes, and grazing rights. He knew the weight of a beef carcass by eye and kept track of accounts in a rough hand that filled a few ledger pages on a table near the only good window. When disputes arose, people remembered that he had once held public office back in Illinois, and that reputation gave his word weight in arguments over strayed cattle or damaged fences. For Tom, he was the man whose shadow fell across the doorway at evening, who brought in the smell of horse sweat and trail dust, and whose rare laugh could loosen the tightness in the house after a long day. Then, while Tom was still very small, that anchor vanished. When Tom was 5 years old, his father died, leaving the ranch without its head and the family without its one steady voice in dealings with the outside world. The details of the illness that carried Greenberry away did not matter to a boy who barely reached the table edge. What stayed was the sight of neighbors' wagons in the yard, the subdued talk in the front room, and the slow walk to the graveyard at China Creek where soil was piled over a plain wooden coffin. From that point forward, every decision about work, money, and survival carried a sharper edge. Without a healthy husband to share the burden, Temperance Ketchum tried to keep the family together on land that was already hard to hold. The Civil War years and their aftermath did nothing to help a widow on the Texas frontier. Markets shifted, currency lost value, and many ranchers found that paper wealth meant little when buyers stayed away or demanded deep cuts in price. By the early 1870s, the Ketchum estate had fallen to less than half of its value from 1860. Fewer cattle grazed the pastures, debts hung heavier, and the feeling in the house rebuilt itself around constant worry. The children still did their chores, but now every broken tool or dead calf cut deeper than before. As the money thinned, Temperance's own body betrayed her. Her eyesight worsened until she moved slowly through the house, reaching out for door frames and chair backs and using touch rather than vision to guide her steps. Lamps no longer gave her any comfort once the daylight faded. She learned the location of every item in the cabin and demanded that nothing be left out of place. When she touched Tom's face or shoulders, her fingers were sure and searching, building a sense of her youngest son that no longer depended on sight. The older daughters and sons watched her hands more and more closely, because a misstep on the rough floor or the stone threshold could send her to the ground. Tom's world tightened again as his mother's world narrowed. He helped carry wood, but also learned to announce himself when he came through the door so she would not be startled. He fetched water not just for stock and cooking, but for his mother's washing. And he listened as older siblings spoke in lower tones at the table after she had gone to lie down. Their talk moved from cattle and weather toward notes owed in town, the need to sell stock, and the absence of a father to speak for them when officials came. For a boy still years away from his teens, the lesson was simple and harsh. Weakness drew pressure, and no outside power intended to soften that pressure just because the household was hurting. Education barely touched him. Schools existed in San Saba County, yet a boy on a struggling ranch could not spend many days sitting on a bench while his family needed another pair of hands. The Ketchum sons were described as ranch boys of little education, and Tom fit that description from his first years of awareness. Letters and numbers mattered less to the family's immediate survival than knowing how to handle a horse, how to repair a broken harness, how to bring a cow and calf out of a muddy creek during a storm, or how to move quickly when trouble showed itself along the road. That balance between letters and labor never shifted in his favor. Outside the cabin, the wider country remained volatile. Rangers based along Richland Creek still rode patrols, keeping watch for raiders or criminals moving through the sparsely settled region. Men around San Saba still told stories of recent killings, stock thefts, and sudden attacks that left bodies on trails and families huddled in fear. Those stories were not distant for Tom. They involved places with names he knew, creeks he had seen, and in some cases, people his family had dealt with. The presence of armed men on horseback acting in the name of state and county law formed an early contrast to the unarmed, overworked figure of his blind mother moving slowly from table to bed. Authority on the frontier carried guns and traveled in groups. Vulnerability stayed at home and hoped to be left alone. In 1873, when Tom was 10 years old, Temperance died. Blindness, strain, and years of unrelenting work ended with another funeral procession, another plain coffin lowered into soil at China Creek Cemetery, this time beside the grave of her husband. For the youngest child, the second loss ripped away the last trace of parental protection. Neighbors and kin came again, offering words and a few days of help. Then they returned to their own fields and herds. The small house at the Ketchum place no longer held a mother's voice or a father's tread. only brothers and sisters who were now forced to sort out what could be saved from the estate. Custom and law decided the next step with a cold simplicity that did not recognize the feelings of a boy who had just buried both parents. The head of the household became the eldest son, Greenberry Jr., known simply as Barry. As was common, the great bulk of the estate passed into his control, leaving little for younger brothers or sisters. The land, the herds, and the better part of the remaining goods answered to him. Sam, now a young man near 20, found himself in a secondary position on a place he had helped hold together. And Tom, at 10, stood at the bottom of the family order. Whatever they had once expected from their father's property now narrowed to whatever Barry chose or was required to share. This new arrangement altered the shape of Tom's days in ways that he could feel even if he did not yet grasp every legal detail. Tasks once assigned by his mother now came from older brothers whose own frustrations were growing. Arguments about money and future plans edged into the evenings. Barry looked outward, thinking of his responsibilities as landholder and of his own prospects. Sam began to speak more often of opportunities beyond San Saba County, of trail work and wages in places where older sons did not sit at the top of every decision. Tom listened and learned that even inside a single family, power followed property more than years of shared labor. After Temperance's death, the Ketchum place felt different whenever travelers or county men appeared. Where a widow had once greeted them with as much dignity as blindness allowed, now a young man handled all dealings. Tom watched these encounters from doorways or from the yard, noticing not only what was said but how men appraised one another's clothes, horses, and confidence. He saw that speaking firmly and carrying visible wealth drew a different reaction than standing in worn boots with nothing to offer but promises. Those small observations formed the beginning of his understanding that the rural order stacked itself against anyone who did not hold paper titles or money on hand. The land around China Creek did not pause to notice these family shifts. Live oaks still cast broken shade over thin grass. Mesquite and cedar still crowded fence lines and had to be cut. Calves still dropped in the spring and had to be branded and counted. Tom continued to work as he always had, only now without a mother to call him in or a father to check his efforts. Sam took on even more responsibility in the physical labor of the ranch, and the two younger brothers spent long days together in pastures, along draws, and at water holes where cattle gathered. In those hours, Tom's loyalty bent more towards Sam than toward the brother who held legal authority over the place. By the time the decade closed, the outlines of Tom's future were already etched into his experiences. He had been born into a frontier county where law rode in armed patrols and where stories of raids and killings were still fresh. He had lost both parents before reaching his 11th year, and had watched the family estate shrink while the remaining property concentrated in the hands of one older brother. He had learned to work from early childhood and had received only fragments of schooling. The boy who stepped out of the Ketchum yard in the mid-1870s carried with him a clear memory of how easily families could be pushed to the edge and how little concern official structures showed for those who were left behind. That memory would stay beneath everything he did when he left San Saba County and followed Sam into the wider cattle country to the west. March 17, 1880. A contempt of court summons in San Saba County put the name Thomas Edward Ketchum on an official docket as a youth who would not come when ordered. The courthouse in San Saba was a plain building that handled land disputes, cattle theft complaints, and the scattered crimes of a thinly settled county. That day, a 16-year-old ranch boy with dark hair and a lean frame stood among older men in worn hats and trail-stained clothes. The clerk read out the charge that he had ignored an earlier order to appear as a witness in another matter. It was not a grand offense. It did not involve a killing or a robbery. It was simply recorded proof that when officers of the court expected obedience from a boy named Tom, They did not receive it. He had grown up in the years since his mother's burial, with no parent in the house and with Barry holding the deeds, the stock, and the final say. Work on the family place had continued, but as the 70s rolled toward their end, that work no longer promised any share of lasting security. Sam had married and then separated. Land had been sold. The family had scattered into smaller units, each trying to find a way forward. Through it all, Tom remained the youngest son who provided labor while watching someone else make decisions about land and money. By the time the contempt charge reached him, he already knew what it felt like to be treated as a replaceable hand. Riding for cattle, sleeping under canvas or in the open and doing the rough jobs left by older men were becoming his new routine. The summons represented the other side of that world, where men he did not know expected him to step away from work and appear before them because a paper said so. He did not respond when they first sent word. The judge's order that followed showed that the state could reach into that rough life and drag him into town when it wished. Nothing in that brief court appearance changed his immediate circumstances. He paid what he had to pay in the form of a fine or cost, heard a few stern words, and walked out again into the street. The lesson that stayed with him did not come from anything the judge said. It came from the cramped courtroom, the clerk's careful ink strokes, and the quiet assumption that the power of that room extended across every pasture and creek. For a boy who had watched his own family's fortunes fall without meaningful help from any official, that assumption had a bitter edge. In the early 1880s, Barry looked west. Land in San Saba County no longer offered him the growth he wanted, and reports from farther toward the Concho and beyond spoke of wide grass, better water, and large outfits hungry for men who knew cattle. When he moved to Tom Green County in search of a larger range, Tom went with him, traveling away from the creek bottoms and small fields of his childhood toward an open country of mesquite flats, broken ridges, and long distances between towns. Tom Green County and the surrounding region revolved around herds and the labor that moved them. Outfits branded thousands of head and hired crews of riders who spent seasons on the trail, pushing cattle to railheads or new pastures. Camps were often nothing more than a wagon, a canvas fly, and a fire. Men slept on bedrolls, woke before dawn to gather horses, and rode out with a rope, a saddle, and a rifle. For Tom, that life offered something his home place never had: constant motion and the chance to measure himself against men who did not know him as the youngest Ketchum boy. Sam moved in and out of the same country. His marriage to Louisa Greenlee ended. He sold what he could, left the settled life behind, and entered the loose world of itinerant cowhands. He sometimes bunked with Nancy and her husband, Abijah Bidge Duncan, and sometimes took work on the range, riding for outfits that needed another capable man for a season. Tom watched this older brother who no longer answered to a fixed homestead and saw another path, one that did not involve waiting for Barry to share anything from a shrinking estate. The Big Half Circle 6 ranch near Knickerbocker hired Sam in 1885 and kept him on the payroll through half the year. Tom followed the same trails, hiring out to ranchers in Tom Green County and beyond. One month he might be riding for a herd near San Angelo. The next he might be trailing cattle toward the Rio Grande. There were no neat records of every brand he worked for, but by the late 1880s, men along the Concho, the Devil's River, and south toward the border were familiar with a dark-haired cowboy named Ketchum, who handled stock well and pushed himself through long days without complaint. The work hardened his body. He grew to nearly 6 feet with weight that came from muscle built over miles of saddle hours and from handling stubborn stock in all weather. Long rides left shoulders broader and hands rougher. Night watches over restless herds sharpened his senses. Lightning storms, flash floods, and dust-filled winds tested his nerve. The same labor stripped away any lingering softness from the boy who had once carried wood to a blind mother. What remained was a compact, strong man whose presence drew notice in line camps and trail crews. Beyond physical strength, years in the saddle taught him marksmanship. He learned to hit targets across creek beds and arroyos, to bring down game cleanly for the pot, and to scare straying cattle with shots placed just off to the side. Pistols and rifles were tools long before they became instruments of crime. His ability with them built a quiet reputation. Cowhands in that country talked about men who could rope, men who could break horses, and men who could shoot. Tom's name began to appear in those talks when the subject was accurate gun work. The same years fostered a temper that showed itself when he felt pushed or insulted. Trail crews lived close, together under strain. Poker games, disputes over horses, or arguments about assignments often ended with fists or drawn weapons. Tom did not cultivate the easygoing manner that kept some men clear of trouble. The men who later rode with him remembered a serious, sometimes sullen companion who watched others closely and responded sharply when crossed. They also remembered an undercurrent of resentment toward Barry that never entirely faded. San Angelo and smaller towns along the Concho gave cowboys places to blow off tension. Dance halls, saloons, and gambling tables offered music, drink, and the chance to lose or win a season's wages in a night. When he came off the trail, Tom joined the flow of men who crowded into those establishments. He saw the way money moved across tables and bars, noticed the proportions that favored owners and gamblers over the men who had earned their pay a few dollars at a time, and added that observation to his earlier understanding of how property gave some people better standing in the public eye than others. January of 1889 brought a new figure to the county power structure in the form of a sheriff named Jerome "Rome" Shields. Rome knew cattle country, but he represented the law's attempt to impose order on it. One of his early arrests did not involve a rustler, a murderer, or a hardened thief. It involved Tom. The offense was simple and recorded in a few dry words. Tom had chased a dog through a church during a religious service, running it down the aisle while the congregation looked on. The act sounded like a prank, yet it cut across the town's sense of decorum and respect. A church service occupied a special space in that community. Charging through it in pursuit of an animal showed contempt for the gathering and for the setting. When Rome Shields put his hands on Tom and marched him out, he sent a signal to every rancher and cowhand watching. The sheriff would not let a trail-hardened cowboy treat the center of town as if it were just another stretch of open range. For Tom, the arrest confirmed what he had experienced with the contempt charge years earlier. Courtroom and church, judge and sheriff all belonged to a world that valued order according to its own rules, not according to the rough work that kept cattle moving and ranches afloat. The men who answered those institutions had never labored through an all-night ride during a stampede or patched themselves up after a fall in bad country simply to preserve someone else's herd. Yet they held the power to fine, scold, and confine men whose hands showed every line of such work. Barry, always careful about his standing, had his own reason to worry when Tom crossed the line that separated bawdy behavior from public offense. On May 23, 1889, at 48 years of age, Barry married Barsha Ola Shields, the sheriff's daughter. The match tied him directly into the network of county power. His own brother now had a record with the new sheriff and had caused a scene in the same town where Barry wanted to appear as a steady, respectable cattleman and prospective husband. According to family accounts, Barry settled the matter in direct terms. Before he left for San Saba County to complete his marriage, he told Tom to be gone from his house for good by the time he returned. Whether those words were delivered in quiet anger or open shouting, their meaning was clear. Whatever tolerance remained for the youngest brother's temper and disrespect had run out. The estate that had once belonged to their parents now stood under Barry's control without any obligation to shelter Tom. Sam did not stay behind. When Tom packed his gear and saddled his horse, Sam joined him. The two younger brothers rode away from Barry's place in Tom Green County, leaving behind the last formal tie to any home ranch that still bore their family name. Ahead lay a life built entirely on day wages, trail jobs, and whatever opportunities crossed their path. The move did not draw notice in town records in the way that a court appearance did, yet it marked a turning point as significant as the contempt charge or the church arrest. From that ride on, neither man answered to an older brother's authority. They spent the next stretch of years following cattle and work through a wider arc of the Southwest. Sometimes they rode beneath the brand of the Half-Circle Six. Sometimes they worked for other ranchers whose names did not survive in written form, but who remembered hiring two tall, capable Texans. The brothers appeared in southern Colorado on occasion, in grazing country near the Pecos in New Mexico, and in the hard ranch lands near the Devil's River and the Rio Grande. Camps on those jobs shared certain constants. Fires burned low to conserve wood. Coffee boiled in blackened pots. Saddles lay on the ground as makeshift pillows. Men rolled into blankets at night with pistols or rifles close at hand. Thunderheads climbed into the sky on summer afternoons, promising sudden rain and the risk of cattle breaking into motion in a wave of horns and hooves. Winters brought cutting wind across open country with little cover. Each hardship bound the Ketchum brothers tighter to each other and further from the town-bound world where Barry now lived as a sheriff's son-in-law. The talk around those fires often turned to the subject of money. Wages for cowhands remained modest. Owners and buyers saw most of the profit from drives and sales. Men who risked their lives on night rides and river crossings went months without seeing cash, and then watched it disappear in a few nights of cards, drink, and women. Some cowboys accepted that cycle as the way things were. Others began to look more closely at the trains that carried payrolls, the stagecoaches that transported valuables, and the ranch stores whose safes held earnings that had not yet filtered down to the men who had helped generate them. Tom's circle of companions during these years included figures who would later stand out as outlaws in their own right. Among them were men like Will Carver and David Atkins, who shared his taste for travel and adventure and whose work histories intersected with his on the big ranches near Knickerbocker and along the border. The four of them spent time together in saloons and camps, talking through the prospects that ranch work offered, telling stories of fights, narrow escapes, and hard winters. These conversations did not yet feature detailed robbery plans, but they sketched a shared sense that cowboy wages were not enough for men who intended to leave a mark. As Tom approached the end of his 20s, the shape of his life could be read in the lines of his face and the entries that mentioned him in formal records. He was tall, strong, and adept with horse and gun. County officials knew him as a man who had ignored a court order and disrupted a religious service. Family experience had taught him that property and position flowed toward men like Barry and away from younger brothers who could only offer labor. Long days on the trail had shown him how wealth moved across the landscape on rail lines and roads guarded by relatively few men. By 1890, he and Sam were well known across the country between San Angelo and the Rio Grande and into parts of New Mexico. They had no stable home, only trails that linked one job to the next and a growing network of associates tied together by shared work and nights in the same saloons. The world of lawful opportunity had narrowed as far as it could. What remained was a hard-earned skill set, simmering anger at structures that had never favored him, and a widening awareness of how much money rolled across the West just out of reach. All of that waited to converge when trains and payrolls began to draw his full attention in the years that followed. 1892. The desert around Nut lay open in every direction, a pale floor of sand, gravel, and short grass broken by low ridges and scattered clumps of creosote. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe tracks cut through it in a straight line, iron rails spiked to ties that baked in the sun by day and cooled fast after dark. A timber water tank and windmill stood beside the line, with telegraph poles in rigid rows stretching toward the horizon. A siding, a low platform, a tool shed, and a section house completed Nut Station, 20 miles north of Deming, on a piece of ground where there was more sky than anything else. By that year, the Ketchum brothers had drifted far from the scrub hills of San Saba. Tom and Sam hired on with ranches from the Pecos River country into southern New Mexico territory, moving from outfit to outfit as the work shifted. They slept in line camps and under wagon sheets, rode fence lines, pushed herds to railheads, and broke rank horses for men who could not sit them. Long days in the saddle left them hard, lean, and sharp-eyed. Tom carried himself with a stiffness that came from old grudges and fresh ones, a man who had learned early that no one gave him anything he did not take. The railroad had changed the country where they worked. Freight trains hauled flour, canned food, clothing, farm tools, and ammunition into the mining districts and hauled ore and bullion back toward mills and banks in the east. Telegraph wires over their heads carried instructions that ranch hands never saw, orders that moved supplies and money in a pattern set by men they would never meet. Pay for section gangs, agents, engineers, firemen, and conductors now traveled in locked express safes, in packets of currency and bags of coin shipped on regular runs. Every 2 weeks, a payroll train went up the line toward Deming, and everyone along that division knew when it passed. In bunkhouses and section houses, Tom Ketchum listened when railroad men talked. On cots pushed against plank walls, at card tables under dim lanterns, he heard them complain of long hours, dangerous work, and wages that never stretched far enough. Voices dropped a little when the subject turned to the Deming payroll, to the heavy safe that sat in an express car while the train crossed miles of empty country. They spoke of the money as something far away from their own pockets even while they hauled it, a prize that belonged to someone else and always would. Tom weighed those words in his mind and fixed his attention on the safe, rather than the men who guarded it. Sam understood what his younger brother was thinking without needing to be told. He had the same memories of short crops, overdue bills, and the sight of furniture being hauled out of a house when debts went unpaid. Now riding range in New Mexico territory, he watched foremen shave wages, watched ranch owners delay payment, and knew the pattern had not changed. The difference was that a single train now carried more money in one locked safe than the brothers could save in a lifetime of honest work. When Tom's eyes followed a locomotive as it rolled past, Sam knew he was not looking at the engine. He was measuring the value inside the express car. The country around Nut Station was not new to them. Herds bound for rail shipping points crossed those tracks. Trail crews used the water tank when they brought cattle across that stretch of desert. On earlier drives, Tom and Sam had camped on the same low ridges, had watched trains roll past at night, the glow from the firebox painting the smoke, the wheels clicking over rail joints in a steady rhythm. They knew how far a man could see from certain rises where the shallow draws ran, and how little cover there was for anyone who tried to approach the line unseen. Word reached them that a large Deming payroll would be riding a specific run. The exact figures mattered less than the fact that it meant real money, gathered in one place. The mines in the hills north and west of Deming needed cash for wages, and the railroad agreed to carry that money. Somewhere to the east, an official had counted out packets of banknotes, tallied bags of silver and gold coin, and signed the papers that sent the shipment west. That decision turned an ordinary train into the best target Tom Ketchum had ever heard described. He did not treat it as loose talk. Planning began in quiet conversations away from other hands. Tom and Sam laid out what they knew, the schedule the railroad kept, the pattern of runs that stopped at nut for water, the length of time the engine would stand under the tank. They would need a small group of riders, men who could hold their nerve under pressure, keep their mouths shut afterward, and obey orders without argument when guns were out. They did not speak of family or future. They spoke of horses, weapons, and ground, the things that mattered in a fast job. Nut Station offered several advantages that fit their needs. The water stop forced the engineer to slow and halt, which meant the train would be moving at their pace instead of its own. The nearest town lay miles away. A telegraph instrument sat in the section house, but the man who worked it could not use it until someone reached the building. The tracks near the station ran mostly straight, so a lookout could spot the headlight far off, yet the low ridges and scattered brush allowed men on horseback to sit out of sight until the exact moment they chose to appear. For an ambush that depended on surprise and quick control, it was nearly ideal. They chose riders they trusted from men they had worked beside on other jobs, men who had already shown that they were comfortable carrying a gun for more than show. Horses were picked with equal care, animals with good wind and solid legs, the kind that could stand waiting without fretting and then run hard when a bellied spur told them it was time. Rifles were cleaned and checked, cartridges laid out and examined. Each man wore a revolver on his hip, not for show but as a tool he might need at arm's length. On the evening they chose, wind rose early, pushing dust along the ground and making the air taste dry and metallic. The sky darkened over the Jornada del Muerto while the last light faded from the low hills around Nut. Shadows from the water tank and station house stretched across the tracks and finally blurred into the general darkness. The gang gathered well away from the siding, out of sight of any section man who might walk around the buildings. Tom went from horse to horse, feeling cinches with his hands, checking that saddle horns were clear of loose gear, that no strap or rope would tangle when a rider swung up in a hurry. They took their positions without talk. One man sat his horse on a rise west of the station, eyes fixed on the rails, waiting for the first glimmer of a headlamp. Another watched the wagon road that led in from the surrounding ranch country. Sam moved back and forth along the trackside with his rifle in the crook of his arm, counting his men, setting them where they needed to be. Tom stood closest to the spot where the locomotive would stop, rifle held in both hands, mind fixed on the next few minutes rather than the dry sweep of years that had brought him there. The distant hum of steel on steel reached them first, a faint tremor in the rails that carried through the ground under their boots. Then a white light appeared to the west, small at first, then steadily brighter as the engine approached. The lookout raised his hand in a signal and edged his horse down from the rise. Men straightened in their saddles. Bandanas were pulled up over the lower part of faces, not for theatrics but to hide features from anyone who might later sit in a witness chair and point. Every rider knew that once the locomotive stopped, there would be no time for second thoughts. The engineer saw the two figures standing by the track before the engine reached the tank. One held a rifle leveled steadily at the cab. The other stood off to one side with another weapon across his arm. Years on the line taught him what that meant. He eased back the throttle and brought the train to a controlled stop at the water tank. Steam hissed from the valves. Tom advanced to the side of the cab and ordered the engineer and fireman down, his voice flat and clear. He told them to leave their hands open and high, to move slowly, to stand where he placed them on the cinder-covered ground. As the engine settled, riders emerged from the darkness. Horses reached the length of the express car and the passenger coaches. Rifle barrels and revolvers pointed up at windows and doorways. From inside the coaches, passengers felt the stop and heard unfamiliar voices. Some raised curtains or leaned toward the glass, catching brief glimpses of shadowed figures with guns, then jerked back as a shouted order told them to stay where they were and keep still. Fear spread quickly in the confined space of those cars. None of them had asked for this fight, Yet all of them were trapped inside metal and wood until the men outside decided it was done. In the express car, the messenger felt every jolt of the brake and knew the train had halted in a place with no depot or platform. His hand went to the revolver near him, then froze when he heard the rattle of the door and commands from outside. A voice he did not recognize told him to open up, to step back and show himself. He knew exactly how thin the wooden door was, how easily a bullet would pass through it and through him. Years of company training gave him clear instructions. Resist if there is a chance. Yield when that resistance only assures a grave. Tonight, surrounded in darkness and cut off from help, he unlocked the door. Tom filled the doorway when it swung inward. Lantern light from inside the car showed his features calm and intent rather than frenzied. His rifle was already at his shoulder, muzzle steady, finger near the trigger. He told the messenger to stand aside, to keep his hands visible, to do as he was told and nothing else. Another outlaw climbed into the car behind Tom with a revolver pointed squarely at the messenger's chest. Steel and oil smells filled the cramped space. At the far end, the safe sat bolted to the floor, black painted, heavy, with its keyhole waiting. The messenger moved under orders and drew his keys with deliberate care. He did not reach for the weapon he had set aside. He knelt at the safe, turned the key and worked the combination with fingers that barely shook only because he forced them to stay steady. Each click of the mechanism sounded loud in the confined car. When the door finally swung open, packets of currency wrapped in paper and twine and cloth bags that clinked softly with coin looked back at him. The whole purpose of the Deming payroll run compressed into a steel box. Outside, Sam kept the rest of the crew under control. He walked the length of the train with his rifle ready, moving the conductor, brakemen, and porters into a small group beside the right-of-way. He forced them to stand facing the desert instead of the train, hands held where every rider could see them. Any man who shifted his weight as if to turn felt the cold touch of a gun barrel at his side and heard a quiet warning. They had all heard stories of crews shot down beside their trains when tempers snapped. None of them wanted to test the patience of the men who had stopped this one. Tom and the outlaw behind him began lifting the sacks and packets out of the safe and passing them through the door. Outside, other hands caught them and slung them over saddle horns. The horses felt the unfamiliar weight and stamped, but were steadied with reins and low words. No loud talk broke the work. The men spoke only when necessary, and then in short phrases. This was not a raid carried out for show in front of a crowd. It was a job that depended on speed and control from the first moment to the last. During the confusion, the conductor found an opening. Held with the others near the right-of-way, he watched the gunmen closely and saw a moment when their attention tilted toward the express car. He edged away along the length of the train, staying within the shadow of the cars until a stack of freight crates blocked him from view. From there, he slipped down the far side of the embankment. He did not run at first. He moved fast but steady, putting distance between himself and the gang before turning toward Nut Station at a full stride. He knew how far it was to the telegraph key, and he meant to reach it. When Tom judged that the safe had been emptied of anything worth carrying, he ordered the messenger to stand still and keep his hands raised. Then he backed toward the door without taking his eyes off the man inside. He stepped down to the ground, signaled that the work was done, and moved to his horse. Around him, riders finished tying off the last sacks, checked their cinches and grips, and swung into their saddles. Sam backed away from the crew on foot but kept his rifle pointed in their direction until he was ready to mount. At Tom's word, the gang turned their horses and left the tracks, not toward Nut Station but into the open land beyond the first low rises. Hoofbeats thudded against the ground and faded as the men angled across the desert. Behind them, the locomotive stood under the water tank, steam still hissing, crew and passengers shaken but alive. The train remained on the rails, its cars intact but stripped of the money that had given the trip its importance. By the time the railroad men gathered themselves, checked their passengers, and made their way to the station house, the conductor had already reached the telegraph instrument. His hand struck the key in quick, hard bursts, sending the news of the hold-up north to Lake Valley and along the line toward Deming. Within a short time, lawmen and armed citizens there were pulling saddles from racks, taking rifles from pegs and lanterns from hooks, leading horses into the street. A posse formed and rode south along the tracks, hoping to close the distance before daylight scattered the trail. The night was not on their side. The outlaws had already turned away from the right-of-way and taken routes that broke their sign across hard ground, arroyos, and low ridges. Wind pushed loose sand over hoofprints. When the sun rose on the country around Nut, the posse found the place where horses had waited, the scuffed dirt where men had stood near the engine, and faint tracks leading away. Beyond a certain point, the marks thinned and vanished on bare rock and packed earth. They searched through the morning and into the afternoon, but each promising line of sign ended in confusion. In the end, they returned to town with tired horses and no captured men. Somewhere beyond those first ridges, Tom and his companions reached a hiding place chosen, long before the job began, a spot with water, grass, and cover for both men and animals. There, away from the tracks and any sudden appearance of lawmen, they opened the sacks and packets they had taken. Banknotes were counted, coin bags hefted, figures spoken aloud and fixed in memory. The sum represented more cash than any of them had ever held. It did not matter that on paper it belonged to a railroad company and miners who would now wait for replacement funds. In the eyes of the men who had risked their lives beside the water tank at Nut, it was theirs. For Tom Ketchum, the robbery at Nut Station marked a turning point that could not be walked back. Until then, he had been a drifting cowhand with a violent streak and a few scraps of trouble behind him. Now he had stopped a railroad train on open track, taken control of everyone aboard, and carried away a payroll that lawmen failed to recover. The success hardened his view of the world. He had tested the reach of the railroad and the law in a direct clash and found that, on that night in New Mexico territory, they could not touch him. From that moment, he measured risk and reward in a new way. And the path he chose ran further from the saddle work of his past and deeper into the outlaw life that would make his name known far beyond the lonely water tank at Nut. December 12, 1895. Cold air pressed down on the hills south of Knickerbocker in Tom Green County while John N. Jap Powers walked through his pasture listening for the small bell fastened to the halter of his missing horse. Short winter grass rasped around his boots and the ground carried the marks of hooves, wagon wheels, and cattle that had moved through the place for years. The sun sat low over the edge of the rough country, throwing long shadows from every mesquite, every clump of brush, as Jap moved steadily toward a line of timber where sound carried strangely. Jap Powers had worked this land for a long time. His place lay near the Atkins place and within riding distance of Barry Ketchum's ranch, part of the scattered community that had grown around Knickerbocker and the draws that fed the Concho country. He raised cattle and horses, traded stock, and moved in the same small circle of ranch families, cowhands, and small-town merchants who depended on one another yet carried grudges that never quite died. Men in San Angelo knew him from the streets, from cattle sales, from evenings in saloons where cards and whiskey pulled wages out of pockets faster than any banker. He had a temper, and he argued loudly when he believed someone wronged him. In town, he had fallen in with the gambling side of that life. Sam Ketchum and Will Carver had taken hold of a saloon and gambling house in San Angelo, drawing cowhands, ranchers, and drifters into games that ran deep into the night. The room held cigar smoke, the sharp smell of spilled liquor, and the clatter of chips sliding across scarred tables. Jap had taken a seat there more than once, chasing hands he believed would turn his way. Instead, The cards ran against him. Debt followed him out of those doors, and the men behind the tables did not forget promises he made when he tried to settle talk with his voice instead of money. Tension grew between Jap and the men who now drifted on the edge of the law. Arguments flared in public rooms and on dusty streets where everyone could hear raised voices. He had quarreled with Sam Ketchum over unpaid gambling losses. He had angered other neighbors through boundary disputes, accusations of trespassing cattle, and sharp words that dug into pride. By the middle of 1895, Jap Powers no longer moved through the country as a man others trusted. Stories spread that he had too many enemies, that his manor and his debts had piled trouble around him higher than the mesquite brush in his own pasture. On the Ketchum side, the circle had tightened. Tom Ketchum, already hardened by years of rough work and earlier clashes with the law, passed between New Mexico and Texas, visiting family near Knickerbocker while keeping distance from sheriffs who had his name on their tongues. He knew the country south of San Angelo, knew which draws offered cover and which ridges gave a clear view of riders coming up from the town. His friendship with Carver and Dave Atkins tied him directly to the knots of resentment aimed at Jap. When talk turned from debts and insults to permanent solutions, Tom sat among men who had both the skill and the willingness to end a problem with rifles instead of arguments. In the Powers household, trouble had seeped through daily life in a quieter way. Jap's wife carried the strain of a marriage twisted by quarrels, debt, and long absences. Their foreman, John Wright, worked close to the family, handling stock, riding fence lines, and spending time around the house when Jap was away. Neighbors later told officers that the widow and Wright had grown too close, that they spoke together in low voices and showed more warmth toward each other than toward the man who owned the land. Whatever words passed between them in private, it was clear that Jap's death would open a path for both of them that his continued presence blocked. Later accounts described a plan shaped in that pressure. Resentful gamblers wanted a debtor removed. A wife tired of her husband's presence and a foreman who shared her interest wanted freedom. Tom Ketchum and his associates formed the hard edge that could turn those desires into action. In that version, money and promises moved between the house and the men who rode with Tom, and a day was chosen when Jap would be alone on his land, away from town, with no one near enough to interfere. The pasture that had carried his cattle for years would become the place where his life ended. The setup depended on routine. Jap knew the sound of the bell tied to his horse's halter. Stock strayed, especially in winter when grass pulled animals toward better forage. Ranchers kept bells on animals for exactly this reason, and Jap had spent many days covering the same ground, listening until the soft ringing from somewhere in the brush guided him to a wandering horse. Tom and his companions understood that habit. They knew that if a bell sounded from the right direction, Jap would follow it without hesitation, thinking of misplaced stock, not of men lying in wait with rifles pressed to aching shoulders. In the brush that lined one side of his horse pasture, several riders dismounted that day and moved into concealment. They led their horses into cover, looped reins around low limbs, and checked their weapons with the methodical care of men who had fired guns often. The brush was thick enough to hide a grown man standing upright, and the tangled limbs provided natural rests for rifle barrels. The men could see through gaps between branches while remaining invisible to anyone crossing the open grass beyond. Someone held the bell that would draw Jap, a simple device with a clapper that chimed whenever the holder shook it gently. Late in the day, with the light beginning to flatten and harden toward evening, Jap walked out from his house in search of the missing horse. The air held a bite that sent breath out in quick white puffs. He wore clothing fit for work, heavy enough for cold but not elaborate. His pasture spread out in front of him, fenced ground broken by gullies, clumps of mesquite, and small rises that hid short stretches of land from the house. He called now and then, the way ranchers did when they tried to bring horses in, his voice carrying across the quiet spaces. Then he heard it. A bell rang from the far end of the pasture near the brush where the riders lay concealed. The sound was faint but distinct. It came again, clear against the still air, exactly like the bell that ought to be swinging from his horse's halter. Jap turned that way without suspicion. He had followed that sound many times before. His boots pressed into soil that crunched lightly under his weight, leaving tracks between old hoof marks and wagon ruts. His eyes stayed on the brush where the noise came from, searching for movement that would show his animal pushing through branches. Inside the thicket, men watched him advance. Rifles rested on branches, cold metal against rough bark, fingers curled around triggers. They could see the front of his shirt, the tilt of his hat, the angle of his shoulders as he continued his steady walk, closing distance with no awareness of the danger he faced. One of the men moved the bell again, giving a short series of chimes that seemed exactly like an impatient horse tossing its head. Jap stepped closer, narrowing the gap until he came within easy range of every rifle pointed at him. When he crossed an unseen line that the gunman had chosen, the bell fell silent. For a moment, the pasture seemed held in place, all sound gone except the faint whisper of wind. Then the rifles fired. Bullets struck Jap from behind, tearing through his back and driving him forward. He collapsed into the grass, his hat rolling aside. The force of the hits folded him into the ground before he could turn or reach for a weapon. Dirt jumped under the impacts and small stones kicked into the air. He lay face down, arms twisted under him as the shooters watched for any sign of movement. One of them stepped out from the brush and crossed the short distance to the fallen man. Jap's body showed the heavy marks of the first volley, but the gunman wanted final certainty. Standing close enough to see the torn fabric and blood seeping into the earth, he raised his rifle and fired again, sending a round into Jap's head at short range. That last shot ruined any chance of survival and guaranteed that the corpse on the ground would stay where it had dropped. The men worked quickly after the killing. They did not linger over the body or search the pockets for keepsakes. They moved back into the brush, collected horses, and left the pasture by a route that kept them away from the house and main road. Hoofbeats carried them across dry washes and along narrow trails known to local riders, leading toward open country where lawmen would have difficulty following tracks for long. Behind them, Jap's body lay in the cooling air, bleeding into his own pasture while the sun slid closer to the horizon. At the house, Mrs. Powers did not raise an alarm immediately. Time passed with no report to neighbors or to any officer in Knickerbocker or San Angelo. That delay would later form part of the case against her, feeding the belief that she knew precisely what had happened in the pasture and chose to let the killers get clear before calling in help. As the afternoon shortened, people nearby noticed that Jap had not been seen since he walked out after his missing horse. Concern began to grow, not because of any sudden sense of catastrophe, but because ranch work followed regular patterns, and this break in routine did not feel right. Near dusk, neighbors finally went searching. Men saddled up, some carrying lanterns, others with only the fading light to guide them. They crossed familiar fences and gates, calling Jap's name and scanning the low country around his place. When they reached the pasture where he had gone earlier, they saw something on the ground near the line of brush. Close inspection brought the reality into focus. Jap Powers lay dead, his clothing soaked and stiff, his body already cooling in the dropping temperature. Lantern light fell across the wounds in his back and the terrible damage to his head, leaving no doubt that he had been shot repeatedly, not killed in any accident or by a single stray round. The scene shook the community. Word moved fast into Knickerbocker and then on toward San Angelo. A rancher, however quarrelsome, had been gunned down on his own place in a manner that spoke of planning rather than sudden rage. Officers from Tom Green County arrived to examine the ground. They looked at the body, counted the wound channels, and studied the brush line where the killers had hidden. Flattened grass and broken twigs showed where men had lain prone or crouched with rifles ready. Tracks from several horses led away from the scene, cutting across bare patches of earth before they scattered into rougher country. The coroner's jury viewed Jap's corpse under crude but sufficient light. They noted bullet holes in his back at different heights, indicating that more than one shot had struck him while he remained upright. They recorded the final wound to his head, fired at close distance, which disfigured his skull and left a broad stain under his body where blood had run into the ground. In their findings, they ruled that he had died from gunshot wounds inflicted by unknown parties lying in ambush. That official language could not capture the violence of the scene, but it did establish in legal terms that someone had waited for him deliberately and killed him without warning. Suspicion did not remain vague for long. Officers already knew that Jap had enemies, and many of those enemies were tied directly to the Ketchums and their associates. Investigators listened to talk from neighbors who mentioned arguments in the San Angelo saloon, unpaid debts, and old threats. They took note of the close behavior between Mrs. Powers and foreman John Wright, and of comments suggesting that she might have wanted her husband out of the way. They also heard riders mention seeing known toughs near Knickerbocker during the days before the murder, including Tom Ketchum and Dave Atkins. All those threads pointed toward a small circle of men who had both motive and means. Within a short time, a grand jury returned murder indictments against Tom Ketchum, Dave Atkins, and Bud Upshaw. The charges named them as participants in a planned killing carried out on Jap's pasture, giving official shape to the rumors that had raced through the county. Warrants went out, but when sheriffs and deputies looked for the accused men, they found nothing but old tracks and empty bunkhouses. Tom had already put distance between himself and Tom Green County. The fast racehorse that his brother Barry prized had carried him away from Knickerbocker, heading toward the New Mexico country he knew well. As winter settled over the Concho region, talk in stores and around stoves repeated the same dark conclusion. People said that a man who once trailed cattle with other hands had now turned into someone who would lie in a thicket and empty a rifle into a neighbor's back. Mothers used his name when they warned children not to wander. Men riding the range spoke of the bell trick in low tones, imagining how it must have sounded to Jap, drawing him step by step toward the rifles that waited in the brush. Each retelling added weight to the idea that Tom Ketchum had crossed a line that no ordinary quarrel explained. In the following year, the legal picture shifted. The sheriff, following new leads and re-examining old ones, came to believe that the first group of indicted men were not the only ones who needed to answer for the crime. Attention turned back to Mrs. Powers and John Wright. Officers questioned them more closely and gathered testimony that pointed toward their involvement in arranging the killing. The widow and her lover faced arrest on murder charges, their names attached directly to the death that had shattered the small community. Yet even as that process unfolded, the men originally suspected remained gone, beyond the reach of summons or jail cells in Tom Green County. For Tom, that winter marked a break with any remaining ties to the settled ranch life he had known in his younger years. Once his name appeared on a murder indictment connected to an ambush that left a neighbor dead in his own pasture. There was no path back to ordinary employment or quiet obscurity. In the Pecos country and beyond, people heard conflicting versions of the story, but nearly all of them agreed on one basic point. When trouble needed a gunman who would do whatever was required, the man called Blackjack Ketchum had stepped forward, and on a cold December day near Knickerbocker, he had helped turn talk of removing Jap Powers into a body lying in the grass. By the time the new year of 1896 opened, Tom rode New Mexico trails with his past in Texas sealed behind him by that killing. The thicket near Jap's pasture still held the scars of rifle fire and the memory of footsteps that had approached a bell without suspicion. Far to the west, under different stars, Tom Ketchum tightened his saddle cinch, checked the cartridges in his belt, and moved deeper into an outlaw life that could not be separated from the gun smoke that had drifted across that pasture near Knickerbocker. June 10, 1896. The settlement called Liberty sat on the high plain east of the Pecos River. A handful of buildings gathered around a store that carried nearly everything the scattered ranchers and sheep herders needed. The structure was wood, squared and nailed, with a false front that tried to give more height to a single story. Inside, shelves held flour, coffee, sugar, cloth, ammunition, tobacco, tools, and cheap clothing. A small space near the back wall held the post office, with pigeonholes for letters and a locked compartment for registered mail. Behind the counter worked brothers Levi and Morris Hertzstein, men who knew every family from the Canadian down toward Fort Sumner, and who understood exactly how hard it was for their customers to pay cash for supplies. The brothers kept ledgers that stretched over years, lines of credit that carried some households through droughts, blizzards, and cattle crashes. They bought hides, wool, and small lots of cattle, advancing goods against the promise of future delivery. At the same time, they handled federal mail and money orders, which meant that hard coin and paper currency flowed through their hands in ways that few country merchants matched. The safe holding that cash and those registered letters stood in a corner behind the counter, a metal box that did not look like much but weighed enough to make 4 men strain if they tried to lift it. To men on the Bell Ranch, Liberty was the closest place to buy new boots, write a letter, or collect a long-awaited parcel from relatives back east. The Bell's vast holdings stretched across the Canadian river country, and its cowhands rode into Liberty when bosses granted passes or when a drive brought them within reach. Sam and Tom Ketchum both worked cattle in that region. They rode for wages under the Bell brand, slept in company bunkhouses, and brought their pay into Liberty when they needed gear or wanted to sit at a table with cards in hand. They learned the layout of the store, the habits of the Hertzstein brothers, and the way business at the counter mixed with the flow of mail in and out of the little post office section. The ranch work that took them there wore on them. They had been cowhands for years, watching owners and loan companies claim the larger share of profits while wages stayed low. Now, after the train robbery at Nut, they knew that a small crew with rifles and nerve could seize in minutes what months of honest work would not bring. The store at Liberty held less money than an express car safe, but more cash and valuable goods than most ranches saw at one time. It also sat on a lonely rise with no town around it, just a handful of houses and sheds scattered along the wagon road. When they left the Bell, they did it quietly. There was no open quarrel with the foreman, no shouted resignation. They rode away with their gear as many other men had done, headed, they said, for a new job in another part of the territory. Behind that excuse lay a plan that had taken shape over nights in the bunkhouse, when talk drifted from cattle and weather toward the weight of the safe sitting in the Liberty store. They knew who slept there, how far it was to the nearest law office, and how long it would take a posse to assemble if anything happened. The day passed with the usual business. Ranch wives came in for staples carrying lists folded in their aprons. Sheep herders appeared with small sacks of wool or hides. A few riders from outlying camps bought tobacco and cartridges. Levi weighed goods on a scratched scale and wrapped them in brown paper. Morris sorted mail and set aside letters for men who were out on the range. By late afternoon, the flow slowed. Dust rose and settled in the street outside. A quiet fell over the store as the last customer stepped out and the door closed behind him. Night came fast in that country. When the sky turned black, light inside the store came from kerosene lamps hung above the counter and from a lantern near the post office wall. The Hertzsteins tallied receipts, locked cash into the safe, and checked the front door. The wind pushed faintly at the building, bringing the smell of dry earth. Somewhere out in that darkness, several mounted men were closing in, moving slowly enough that their horses' shoes did not ring loudly on the packed soil of the road. The outlaws reached Liberty after full dark. They approached from an angle that kept them out of sight of the front windows, then dismounted and led their horses behind a shed. Hooves thudded softly. The men checked revolvers and rifles, pulled bandanas up over their faces, and moved toward the back of the store. One carried a short steel bar wrapped in cloth to muffle noise. The rear door was locked, but the wood around the latch was old and easier to break than the metal itself. A few blows with the padded bar cracked the jamb and slammed the door inward. Inside, Levi and Morris heard the impact and moved toward the sound, assuming at first that a customer in trouble had hammered on the back. They reached the passage between the counter and the storeroom and saw shapes filling the doorway, men with their hats pulled low and cloth covering their noses and mouths. Rifles and handguns pointed into the room, close enough that the lamplight gleamed on oiled barrels. Any thought of resisting died in the instant when the intruders shouted for them to raise their hands and stand still. Tom was at the front, his eyes scanning the room, not in a hurry but wasting no motion. His rifle stayed trained on the brothers while his partners moved to secure them. One outlaw stepped behind the counter and pushed Levi forward with a revolver pressed into his back. Another ordered Morris to stand against the wall near the safe. The air inside was thick and smelled of oil, dust, and the faint, acrid scent of spilled kerosene. The only sounds were short commands and the rough breathing of men who had crossed a line once more. They wanted the contents of the safe, the cash drawer, and anything in the post office section that could be traded quickly or sent through fences. Registered mail pouches came first. The robbers marched Morris to the post office compartment and forced him to unlock the case holding the sacks. Sealed letters and small parcels spilled out when the outlaws dumped the pouches onto the counter. They scooped them into flour sacks, ignoring addresses, knowing the value lay in whatever cash, drafts, or jewelry might be inside. Levi was made to kneel in front of the safe with his hands visible. Under the barrel of a rifle, he worked the combination and swung the heavy door open. Bundles of currency, coin rolls, and bags holding mixed silver and gold gleamed within. The men behind him cursed softly in approval. They stripped the shelves inside, stuffing the proceeds into sacks until the containers bulged. Tom kept his rifle trained alternately on each brother, stepping just enough to see that neither reached for a hidden weapon or tried any desperate move. When the safe and post office section had been emptied, they turned to smaller goods. One man swept shelves of revolvers and boxes of ammunition into another bag. Another grabbed watches and small items kept in a glass case near the counter. They moved quickly but not frantically, each knowing exactly what they wanted and how much time they could afford to spend. The whole operation took minutes, but for the Hertzsteins on their knees under gunpoint, the stretch felt endless. The brothers survived the immediate burglary. The robbers forced them to lie face down on the floor with their hands out to the side, then walked backward toward the broken rear door, guns still covering the two storekeepers. Once outside, they melted into the dark, mounted their horses, and disappeared into the open country beyond Liberty. Only after the hoofbeats faded did Levi and Morris dare to rise, hearts still racing, bodies stiff from the forced position on the rough boards. Anger replaced fear fast. Instead of treating the raid as a blow to be absorbed quietly, Levi resolved to help track down the men who had invaded his store. Word went out at first light. Riders carried the news to neighboring ranches and to officers who served that stretch of New Mexico territory. By afternoon, a small posse had formed, including Levi himself, a man named Hermenegildo Gallegos, and two other locals who knew the arroyos and mesas leading toward the Pecos. They armed themselves with rifles and revolvers, filled canteens, and followed the sign that led away from Liberty. The tracks were clear at the start. Several shod horses had left the store and taken a line that angled away from the main road. Hoof prints showed deep in places where the ground was soft. The posse followed them through low swales, across washes, and over the long, gentle rises that broke the plain. They found places where the outlaws had paused briefly, hoof marks scuffing in tight circles, then moved on. All along the trail, Levi's anger burned. He had seen the eyes over those bandanas, had heard the voice that forced him to empty his own safe. He wanted those men stopped, and he intended to stand there when it happened. The trail led them toward the Plaza Largo Arroyo, a rough drainage that fed into the Pecos region. The arroyo cut sharply into the plain, its banks steep and broken in stretches, fringed with brush that offered cover for man or animal. Cottonwoods and willows grew in the bends where water sometimes stood. It was the kind of place an experienced rider would choose for a stand, where high ground overlooked narrow approaches and where anyone forced to ride in would be exposed. The outlaws reached that country first and used its features. They chose a position along the edge of the arroyo where they could see anyone coming along the trail. Horses were led down out of sight into a side cut, reins looped over stout branches. Rifles were unscabbarded and checked again. Cartridges were placed where fingers could find them without looking. The men settled into positions behind rocks and thick brush, their bodies pressed close to the earth, their gun barrels forming a hidden line across the shallow bowl of ground where they expected the posse to appear. Late on June 13, dust on the horizon marked the approach of the pursuers. The posse did not know exactly where the Ketchum party had stopped, but they knew it could not be far. They rode in a loose formation, eyes scanning the ground and the arroyo banks. The sun beat down on their hats and shoulders. Sweat darkened shirt collars. Rifle stocks brushed against saddle skirts. Levi rode near the front, straight-backed despite fatigue, intent on finishing what had begun in his store days earlier. As they closed on the chosen spot, the outlaws waited until the distance shrank enough to turn aimed shots into certain hits. No warning was shouted. The first indication the posse had that their quarry was near came when muzzle flashes burst from the brush along the arroyo rim. The crack of rifles rolled over the dry land in a sudden, ragged volley. Bullets tore through the air, struck men and horses, and punched into dirt and rock. Levi took a round that knocked him from his saddle. The impact broke his grip on the reins and threw him hard to the ground. His horse reared and bolted, eyes rolling, then ran off down the arroyo edge. Levi lay still, his clothing spreading dark as blood soaked through. Nearby, Hermenegildo Gallegos tried to turn his mount toward cover, but another shot hit him and he slumped, falling sideways with a clatter of spur and rifle. One of the remaining possemen felt a ball strike his arm, spinning him around in the saddle and numbing his hand. The survivors tried to answer the attack, but their position left them exposed. Their horses milled or broke away, driven frantic by the gunfire. Men scrambled for rocks and sparse brush, returning fire at muzzle flashes that vanished between shots. The outlaws had the advantage of ground and preparation, and they used it without hesitation. Their shots were measured, not wild. Each time a head or shoulder showed above a scrub clump, a rifle cracked and sent more lead into the already chaotic scene. Sam and Tom controlled their field of fire with the same discipline they had shown at Nut. From their concealed positions, they watched for any sign that one of the posse might reach a better angle. They saw Levi fall and stay down, saw Gallegos collapse, and shifted their shots to keep the remaining men pinned. The smell of burnt powder spread along the arroyo rim. Empty cartridges tumbled down the slope as they worked their actions and cleared their sights. The fight did not last long. Once two of their number lay dead and others were wounded or pinned in place, the posse's will collapsed. The survivors focused on staying alive rather than pressing any attack. They crawled, slid, and stumbled toward what little cover they could reach, bullets snapping overhead and striking stones around them. One man managed to reach his horse and haul himself into the saddle with his injured arm hanging useless at his side. Another used the slope of the arroyo to shield his movements as he staggered away on foot. Seeing that the remaining pursuers were in no condition to continue, the outlaws pulled back from the rim. They moved to their horses, mounted swiftly, and rode away along the arroyo edge, staying on broken ground where tracks would be difficult to follow. They did not descend to the scene of the killings or attempt to take trophies. Their goal was distance, not display. Within minutes they were gone, leaving only echoing reports thinning in the hot air and two bodies cooling on the rough ground. Later, when reinforcements arrived and the survivors guided them to the site, the full extent of the ambush became clear. Levi lay on his back where the fall had thrown him, eyes fixed on a sky he no longer saw. His shirt was torn where the bullet had entered, and blood had soaked into the dirt under his shoulders. Gallegos lay a short distance away, twisted in an unnatural position, his hat lost, his hair streaked with blood and dust. Horses stood nervously nearby or had to be caught at a distance, still panicked by the noise of the firing. The men who came after were not strangers. They knew Levi as a merchant, a neighbor, and a man who had extended credit to them when times tightened. Now they saw him sprawled on the earth, killed while trying to reclaim what had been stolen from his store. Their shock turned to rage, and that rage focused on the names already attached to the Liberty burglary. Talk filled the Liberty area and spread along the Pecos that Tom and Sam Ketchum had not only robbed the Hertzsteins but had met a citizen posse in the arroyos and left two of its members dead for daring to follow. The territorial authorities treated the incident as more than a simple gunfight. This was not a quarrel between two ranchers or a brawl in a saloon. Armed men had robbed a post office, stolen federal mail, and killed a merchant and a local man who had ridden under color of law to chase them down. That combination drew the attention of United States Marshals and railroad detectives who already knew the Ketchum name from the payroll train near Nut. Reports circulated through offices in Santa Fe and beyond, describing the Liberty burglary and the Plaza Largo ambush in detail. For Tom, the fight on the Pecos showed another step in the progression that had started with a refusal to answer a court summons and had moved through the pasture killing in Knickerbocker and the train robbery near Nut. At Liberty, he had turned his guns on a merchant and a mail safe. In Plaza Largo Arroyo, he and his companions had stood in prepared positions and cut down a posse with controlled rifle fire. The killings of Levi Hertzstein and Hermenegildo Gallegos taught the region a simple lesson. Pursuing Blackjack Ketchum across open country did not mean a rough arrest after a chase. It meant riding under the constant risk of sudden, accurate gunfire from ground he had chosen and prepared. From that week in June, his name carried not just the weight of theft and train robbery, but the certainty that trying to stop him could leave a man's body lying in dust and sage with no time to fire more than a few desperate shots in reply. May 14, 1897. The westbound train rolled out of Lozier, Texas, into a darkness broken only by the pale glow of the locomotive's firebox and the thin line of stars over the desert, and Thomas Edward Ketchum moved with it, climbing the iron steps of the tender with a rifle in his hands and a killing resolve already hardened inside him. He had come to the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio line with a clear plan. He, Will Carver, and Dave Atkins had ridden for days through dry draws and broken limestone to reach the lonely depot west of Langtree. Telegraph poles marched along the track, the only man-made line through a scrub country of mesquite and cactus. The little cluster of railroad buildings offered no resistance that night. Lozier was only a water stop and siding, a place where trains paused to take on fuel and move on. Passengers saw nothing more threatening than a handful of cowhands at the edge of the lamplight, horses tied in the shadows. Inside the cab, Engineer George Freese and fireman Jim Beauchat were watching their gauges and the stretch of track ahead when the outlaws came over the tender. Carver dropped first, his revolver covering the crew while Ketchum stood above them, the barrel of his Winchester angled toward their chests. There were no shouted speeches, only clipped orders. Freese eased back the throttle and kept his hands where the gunman could see them. Beauchat stared at the rifle muzzle and did not move. The train gathered a little speed and then settled into the grade, steel wheels singing along the rails toward the first cut east of Lozier. Out ahead, Atkins waited with the horses and a bundle of dynamite. Earlier he had walked down the line and clipped the telegraph wires, leaving the signal system dead. No alarm could run ahead of the train now. When the locomotive came into view, steam blowing against the rock walls, Atkins swung a lantern. Freese braked under Ketchum's command and the cars shuddered as they ground to a stop inside the cut. The desert night closed in again, broken now by the panting of the engine and the sharp voices of armed men. The express car behind the mail coach held the money they wanted. Wells Fargo shipments traveled in locked safes, one small and one large, bolted to the floor. Messenger W.H. Joyce knew that only the through safe carried serious money, and that the time lock on that box was meant to resist anyone who tried to force it on the road. He also knew that the three strangers outside carried the advantage. At gunpoint, Beauchat and Freese were pushed ahead as shields. Joyce saw their silhouettes in the doorway and understood that refusal meant dead railroad men before anything else. When he tried to stall, rough voices cut him off. One of the bandits swung a rifle butt against the metal of the door and ordered him to open up. Joyce finally unbarred it and stepped back, hands raised. The gang poured into the car, lantern light throwing their shadows across stacked freight. The messenger told them that the way safe was empty. Ketchum refused to take his word and drove him aside. The men shoved the smaller safe into position for explosives. Sticks of dynamite came out of Atkins's bundle, fuses already cut and ready. They packed the charges against the first safe, wedged sacks and freight around it, and lit the fuse. In the closed car, the blast hammered every surface, throwing splinters and metal fragments across the floor. The way safe door buckled, revealing enough money to show that Joyce's story had not been honest. They scooped up what they found and went to work on the larger strongbox. More dynamite went onto the iron skin of the through safe. Once again the car shook. Glass windows blew inward and the heavy box finally split. Paper currency and coin spilled out in a loose heap. The robbers filled canvas sacks with everything they could reach. Company officials later put the loss at tens of thousands of dollars, naming a figure that dwarfed any sum the crew would earn in years at their regular work. Passengers, held in their coaches under guard, heard only the muffled blasts and the occasional barked order. When the gunmen were done, they left the coaches untouched. They had come for money, not for jewelry or small personal property, and they had found more than enough to move on. Freese and Beauchat were ordered back into the cab. Under revolver sights, they nursed the locomotive forward to the place where the gang's horses waited. There, Ketchum gave his last order, a command to run on toward daylight and report what had happened. The engineer obeyed. The train pulled away from the cut, leaving behind a torn express car and 3 men on horseback with heavy sacks slung across their saddles. News of the Lozier robbery spread quickly through the railroad offices in Texas and then outward through law officers and federal marshals. The size of the haul enraged Wells Fargo supervisors and local sheriffs alike. Posses rode out from several directions, following sign where they could and guessing when they could not. The countryside offered the outlaws cover in the form of rocky arroyos and isolated waterholes. The gang moved at night and rested only when their horses could not stand another mile. They changed mounts at friendly ranches, paid lavishly for food and shelter, and cursed every rumor that their names were already circulating as suspects. For all the effort behind them, the pursuers never closed the circle. The brothers and their partners slipped across county lines and out of the reach of Texas lawmen who did not want to follow them into another jurisdiction. When they finally crossed back into familiar New Mexico country, dust-covered and worn, the men had money in their pockets and the knowledge that they had shaken some of the best riders law enforcement could send after them. That knowledge did not soften Ketchum. It hardened him. He had seen that a train, stopped in the right place with the right preparations, could be forced open with explosives and nerve. He meant to do it again, and he meant to do it in a place where the consequences would be even harsher if anyone ever put shackles on his wrists. The New Mexico Territory had made train robbery a capital crime 10 years earlier. Railroad attorneys and territorial legislators had pushed that statute through in response to earlier holdups, arguing that a moving train full of passengers, mail, and money faced a unique level of danger. Hanging now waited at the end of any case where a jury found an accused man guilty of stopping a train with force and taking treasure from it. Ketchum knew that, yet the law read to him as a direct challenge. In his mind, the statute divided men into two kinds: those who stayed clear of the tracks and those who dared the gallows for the sake of an express car full of currency. He did not intend to remain in the first group. By the summer of 1897, he had joined his brother Sam again. They gathered Carver and Atkins and another man who used the name Charles Collings. The 5 men brought saddlebags full of ammunition and dynamite into the northeastern corner of the territory, to a stretch of line between the little town of Folsom and the settlement of Des Moines. Here the rails climbed through open ranch country toward the low rise known as Twin Mountain, a place where the old Fort Union wagon road crossed the tracks. The grade slowed heavy trains as they ground upward. There were few houses, fewer section hands, and no depot within several miles. It was exactly the kind of place Ketchum wanted. The gang spent days studying that bend in the line. They watched trains laboring up the slope, counted cars, noted where the crews opened their throttles and where the wheels squealed hardest against the rails. They marked a spot where the train would be least able to escape a gunman's demand. A section of curve where the locomotive and express car would be on the inside and the coaches behind them would be hidden by the embankment. They measured walking distances along the track so they would know precisely where to leave horses, fresh and ready beyond the actual stopping place. On the afternoon of Friday, September 3rd, the men moved into final position. Twilight slid across the plains, turning open grassland into a broad gray sheet broken by the darker shape of Twin Mountain and the pale streak of track running toward it. In the distance, Folsom lay in a shallow valley with its frame buildings, corrals, and stock pens. Town lights were already beginning to glimmer as the Colorado and Southern passenger train, still operating under the Union Pacific Denver and Gulf name on that section, prepared to leave the depot and head south. In the brush near the bend, rifles were loaded and bandanas adjusted over faces. Dynamite sticks sat ready in a canvas bag. Train number 1 left Folsom with a whistle and the steady chuff of exhaust gathering speed as it moved out of town. Houses and pens slipped past, then the last fences gave way to open range. In the express car, Messenger Charles P. Drew checked his way safe in the larger through safe, the same type of iron box Joyce had watched explode in Texas months before. Drew was an experienced man, used to moving payrolls and registered packages along lonely lines, but he knew that New Mexico's death statute had not frightened every desperado away from the rails. He carried his duties out with care, checking seals and locks as the train began the climb toward Twin Mountain. Out on the line, near the curve the gang had chosen, the night was quiet. When the locomotive's headlight finally showed downtrack, Ketchum stepped from his cover. As at Lozier, there were no dramatic speeches, only sharp commands. He climbed onto the blind baggage as the train slowed under his rifle, then forced the engineer to halt at the precise point he had chosen. Armed men moved along the coaches, warning passengers to stay seated and keep their hands away from windows. No one argued. The glow from the firebox and the lantern showed faces that meant business, men who had already shed blood in other counties. Drew felt the car lurch as the brakes came on hard. He heard footsteps on the gravel, and the click of metal against metal as someone worked around the end of the car. A moment later, the door rattled under a fist. Voices demanded that he open it. He delayed as far as his nerve allowed, checking his revolver and weighing his odds against unknown numbers outside. When the door finally swung inward, he faced men with masks and guns, their clothing dust-stained from the ride, their eyes steady. He was dragged clear of the doorway and forced to stand aside while the outlaws took control of the interior. Later accounts from railroad men spoke of how badly he was handled in those first moments, shoved and struck until his resistance faded into simple survival. Dynamite went to work again. As at Lozier, the bandits set charges against the safes using freight and bedding as tamping. They warned Drew and anyone else in reach to stay low and cover their heads. The first blast buckled the smaller safe. A second and third hammered the through safe until its thick door twisted and tore open. The express car filled with acrid smoke and dust, shards of iron and splinters of oak. The gang moved through that choking interior with practiced speed, scooping cash, coins, jewelry, and a consignment of silver spoons into their sacks. When they were finished, the floor of the car was littered with debris. The messenger stood shaken, ears ringing, trying to draw breath in air that tasted of burned powder and dynamite fumes. The men with the guns did not linger. They backed out, keeping their weapons pointed inside until the door slid shut. Outside, another man kept watch over the coaches. There had been no shots fired at passengers, no attempt to search every traveler. But the violence inside the express car and the blast that rocked the train left no doubt in any mind regarding what the gang was willing to do. Under order, the engineer nursed the locomotive forward once more to the spot the robbers specified. There, horses stood waiting, held by one man who had stayed in the shadows during the robbery. Sacks of plunder were loaded quickly. Saddles creaked under the new weight. In a final gesture of control, Ketchum told the crew to keep the train moving and to waste no time notifying the railroad of what had taken place. The men obeyed at once. Within minutes, the locomotive and its damaged express car were shrinking into the distance, headed toward the next telegraph key that still had a live wire. The gang rode away from the tracks toward country they knew better than any lawman. They left a scene that railroad investigators later documented in careful detail, measuring splintered timbers and twisted safe metal and taking sworn statements from shaken crewmen. Contemporary figures for the stolen funds ranged from a few $1,000s in cash to more when jewelry and the shipment of silver spoons were counted, enough in any case, to mark the robbery as a serious blow to the express company and to the territorial reputation of safety along that line. They did not stay near Twin Mountain. For a few miles, they followed cattle trails and dry creek beds, then cut north and west toward rougher ground. The men aimed for a hiding place that had served them before. Turkey Creek Canyon, a remote slot in the foothills northwest of Cimarron. Brush and timber crowded the slopes there. The creek twisted between rock walls and narrow benches offered space for campfires that could be hidden under overhanging trees. A man watching from such a perch could see anyone approaching along the canyon bottom long before strangers saw him. In that canyon, the men divided their spoils, cleaned their weapons, and tended to bruises that came from their own explosives as much as from crew resistance. Horses were rubbed down and re-shod with care because the next stage of their flight would take them far beyond New Mexico's immediate reach. Talk around the fire ran to the figures they had pulled from the safe, to the way the messenger had looked when he realized that the law he trusted for protection had been hours away and useless. The others laughed when they repeated how quickly a man's determination could evaporate once dynamite began to speak on the robbers' side. From Turkey Creek, the gang drifted toward the country around the Chiricahua Range, following a familiar route into an even more secluded refuge in Arizona. Behind them, they left a line of torn rails and frightened railroad men, a newspaper trail of headlines and editorials calling for harsher enforcement, and a deepening sense among passengers that certain stretches of track in New Mexico belonged more to armed bandits than to the companies that laid them. Each robbery added to that feeling, and each time Ketchum rode away from a wrecked express car with money in his saddlebags, his name moved closer to the top of every wanted list in the Southwest. December 9, 1897 to July 1898. The smoke from the Twin Mountain robbery still clung to Tom Ketchum in more ways than one when the gang eased out of their cave south of Folsom and pushed west toward the Arizona line. Winter settled across the high country, cold and thin, and the men carried fresh scars from September that had not fully healed. Tom rode at the head, heavy-shouldered in his dark coat with Sam close by, and behind them Will Carver and Dave Atkins. They steered toward the rough country of the Chiricahua Mountains where rock, scrub oak, and thick brush could hide a gang that lived on stolen money and the constant threat of a knock on the door at night. Texas Canyon in southeastern Arizona gave them exactly that. The place sat in a jumble of boulders and broken ridges with a chinked log house tucked in a clearing and a spring that seeped out of rock to feed a narrow ribbon of green. Freight wagons passed now and then along the road, and the Southern Pacific line ran not far away. The gang slept on bedrolls spread in the shadows of big stones and took turns watching the narrow approach to the cabin. Tom paced the clearings with a rifle under his arm and a cigarette in the corner of his mouth, thinking about money. The haul from Twin Mountains had not stretched as far as the men had hoped. Food, fresh horses, and safe shelter for wanted men had eaten the cash almost as fast as they had won it. Word bounced along saloon bars and campfires that a big train would carry a load worth taking through New Mexico and Arizona before Christmas. Those rumors drifted through mining camps and ranch cookhouses, crossed the line into Texas Canyon, and finally reached Tom's ears. The name that kept coming up was Stein's Pass, the narrow cut through the rock where the Southern Pacific Sunset Limited clawed its way up grade near the New Mexico and Arizona border. The pass had a little cluster of buildings called Stein's, a post office nailed into one wall of a general store, a railroad depot with a telegraph key, and a few scattered houses that leaned against the wind. To Tom, the combination of isolated track, a station, and a heavy train sounded like an invitation. Early in December, United States Marshals in both territories caught wind of the same talk and tried to guess which night, which train, and which cut the robbers would choose. They had no sure date and no clear description of the outlaws, only the sense that a band of professional road agents was moving somewhere near the tracks. While officers tried to thread the rumor together, Tom settled on a plan that started not with the train itself, but with the depot and the small government outpost inside it. A post office kept government money and registered mail. The depot kept railroad cash and express funds. In Tom's mind, both sat like unlocked boxes along the tracks. On Thursday evening, December 9, 1897, the gang moved. The air, in the little settlement of Steins, held coal smoke from the station stove and the faint smell of livestock from corrals behind the houses. The sun had already dropped behind the ridges when Dave Atkins and a local man named Edward Cullen stepped into the cramped post office. The place held little more than a counter, a few pigeonholes for letters, and a cash drawer. The postmaster had no warning. Dave pushed iron in his face and told him to hand over everything. The drawer coughed up a handful of coins and a few bills. $9 hardly counted as a strike, but Dave swept it into a sack. They crossed the track and went straight into the depot. Inside, the station agent, Charles St. John, worked by lamplight with a telegraph key at his elbow, a train register book open on the desk, and a few company envelopes stacked nearby. Sam grabbed him hard by the collar and slammed him against the wall, while Atkins raked through drawers and cash boxes for railroad and express money. The total came out to little more than a couple of dollars in some company scrip. Tom stood in the doorway, black hat low over his eyes, watching the room and the platform beyond it, while the telegrapher sat frozen on his stool and tried not to glance at the rifle in Tom's hands. When Tom took the man's Winchester .44 and set it by the door, the depot and post office lay stripped of what little cash they had. The real target still rode the rails. After they finished with the buildings, the gang used the captured depot man as a tool. Tom marched St. John outside and ordered him to bring a red signal later on, at the right time, and hold it steady in the darkness. Then Tom and Will led the horses 2 miles down the line and built 2 bonfires on either side of the track. Flames licked at the cold night air and sent a wavering orange glow across the rails. Those fires would mark the spot where they meant to strip the train. In the meantime, Sam, Atkins, and Cullen waited near the depot with the station man under guard. Westbound train number 20 climbed toward the pass in the dark, its engine pushing steam into the thin night like a forced breath against the grade. The rails curved and rose, and the Sunset Limited rolled with a string of coaches, a mail car, and an express car that held the locked iron safe Wells Fargo relied on. Inside that car, Messenger Charles Jennings worked with 2 armed guards, men hired because the company knew what had happened at Lozier and Twin Mountains earlier that year. They had heavy revolvers, a rifle, and stacked ammunition, and they knew that train robbery in New Mexico meant the rope if the law caught the right men. Near 9 at night, as the locomotive eased into Steins, Charles St. John stepped onto the platform under orders with the captured red lamp in his hand. He swung it as the headlight came into view. The engineer, Thomas North, saw the danger signal cutting through the dark and set his brakes. Steam roared as the big machine slowed. Before the train had fully stopped, masked men swarmed up, yanked the cab crew from their seats, and shoved barrels within inches of their chests. Tom told North to move the engine and the forward cars up to the place marked by the fires and to do it steady without tricks. If he tried anything, Tom promised to blow his head off on the spot. When the engine rolled to a halt beside the bonfires, the rocks around the track jumped with shadows. The outlaws ordered the passenger coaches uncoupled, leaving the mail and express cars hitched to the locomotive. They dragged that short train forward to a more isolated stretch of track, away from any light that might carry back toward town. Inside the express car, Jennings and his guards heard the harsh voices outside and the clank of coupling pins as the cars were separated. They braced behind the heavy door with rifles ready, the space around them close and hot from the stove, though the night outside stood near freezing. Tom's men pounded on the car and shouted for the door to come open. Instead, they took bullets. Jennings and the guards fired through the wood and the narrow openings, sending splinters into the faces of the men outside. Muzzle flashes strobed the car's windows, and the darkness outside spat fire back at them. One outlaw dragged a sack of dynamite toward the door and tried to wedge charges where they would force the lock and hinges. Bullets tore through canvas, flesh, and air as both sides tried to settle the matter in the space of a few heartbeats. The fight burned fast and violent. 4 of the gang took lead. In that crush of noise and smoke, Edward Cullen lifted his head at the wrong instant. A bullet caught him clean. Witnesses later talked about the way his skull opened and how he dropped in a loose heap by the rails, face turned toward the sky, blood soaking into cinders and snow. The shock of his death tore a hole in the gang's courage that no amount of swagger could patch. With several men wounded and no way to knock open the express car without blowing themselves apart in the bargain, Tom snarled a curse, signaled a retreat, and ordered the men back to the horses. They left Cullen where he lay, stiffening beside the track, while the express guards reloaded and peered into the dark for a second wave that never came. The gang slid into the rocks, scrambled back toward Texas Canyon, and reached the chinked cabin before dawn. There, in the sour air of sweat, gunpowder, and homemade liquor, they cleaned wounds as best they could. Atkins nursed a hurt arm. Another man had a flesh groove along his side, and everyone carried splinters and powder burns. Tom's temper grew raw. He blamed Dave for spreading talk in mining camps while drunk, blamed the men who had fired from the car, blamed anyone he could reach with words because no money sat on the table and one of their own had died for only a handful of coins. Lawmen, meanwhile, trailed rumors instead of sure tracks. Within days, a posse swept through Texas Canyon and rounded up 6 men who had been living near the hideout, among them Leonard Alverson, Walter Hovey, and William Warderman. They were thieves and smugglers, used to shade more than daylight, and they had given the Ketchum gang shelter and food. Federal authorities decided that was enough. A jury shown a wound in Hovey's leg and urged to believe it came from the gunfight at Stein's Pass, convicted the 3 of post office robbery and sent them to prison. Tom and Sam later admitted their own roles, but the men they had left behind stayed in cells until a presidential pardon came years afterward. By then, the damage to their lives had long since been done. The Stein's Pass failure cut the gang's funds to the bone. They still had horses, guns, and the knowledge of every dip and rise between the Rio Grande and the High Plains. But the cash that made that freedom possible had nearly vanished. Tom's answer followed the same pattern as before. When one train did not pay, he looked for another. The next target lay back in Texas on the Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio line, the same stretch that carried the rich Lozier Hall earlier. Comstock Station sat midway between Langtree and Del Rio, near rough country above the Devil's River. A few buildings clung to the right-of-way there, and the rails ran past scrub hills and deep draws, perfect for hiding horses and loot. On Thursday, April 28, 1898, the gang moved into position. Wind rolled over the low hills and rattled brush along the cuts near Comstock. Shortly after 11 at night, westbound train number 20 left the small station and picked up speed, its headlight throwing a white cone ahead of the engine. In the cab, engineer Walter Jordan and his fireman tended boiler and throttle, unaware that shadows clung to the steps. 2 masked figures slipped into the cab, shoved cold steel against Jordan, and ordered him to stop. 2 more moved along the train to uncouple the passenger coaches, leaving the engine hitched only to the mail and express cars. Once the train stood where they wanted it, the outlaws forced Jordan to pull the shortened consist ahead to a lonely point near a place called Helmet. There the track ran across open ground that gave no shelter to passengers on foot and no quick help from town. In the mail and express cars, the men on duty felt the train slow and stop in an empty stretch where no scheduled halt existed. The express messenger that night was Richard Hayes, and he had a Winchester laid handy. As bootsteps thudded on the platform outside, he worked the lever and braced behind his safe. When the door came open, Hayes tried to fight. He shouldered the rifle and pulled the trigger, but the cartridges jammed. Metal scraped and stuck. With masked barrels aimed at his chest and no way to clear the weapon fast enough, he had no choice but to surrender. The outlaws tied him and the other car crew and began methodical work. First, they emptied the small waste safe, sweeping currency and whatever valuables they could find into sacks. Then they placed sticks of dynamite beside the big-time locked-through safe, stacked the emptied-way safe on top of the charges, and ran a fuse out along the floorboards. When the fuse burned down, the explosion tore through wood and iron. The blast drove splinters through the walls and roof of the car, lifted the way safe into the air, and flung it out through the ceiling into the darkness. Smoke and dust filled the car, choking everyone inside and coating eyes and lungs. The gang stepped back in with lanterns once the worst of the fumes cleared and dug through wreckage for whatever cash the main safe had held. Later reports would argue over the size of the haul, swinging between small change and a considerable sum. But the one fact that mattered to Tom was that he now had bundles of currency in his hands again and no dead man at his feet. Back near Comstock, the telegraph lines came back to life as the crew found their voices and sent word. By the time dawn reached the Devil's River country, posses and railroad detectives had already started toward the scene. Special Officer Fred Dodge, working for Wells Fargo, studied tracks and questioned every frightened witness he could find. Descriptions wavered between a big man with a foreign accent and several smaller companions, some saying there had been 4 masked raiders, others swearing there had been 6. Off the record, railroad and expressmen whispered names: Tom Ketchum, Dave Atkins, Bud Upshaw. Their guesses would later harden into recorded history, but in that first stretch after the robbery they had only scattered, shaken memories and night shadows to go on. Tom and his men vanished into the brush and rough country they knew so well, driving their horses hard until daylight and then cutting sign across stone where tracks would fade. They had a start of several hours on their pursuers and used every mile of it. When they finally eased off their pace, it was back in familiar ground in Tom Green County, where they had friends, old haunts, and caches a short ride from the trails. The men bought food with silver that had passed through many hands and kept to the edges of ranches where no one asked questions too loudly. Despite the new money, strain hung in the air. Weeks later, restless and greedy for more despite the risks, Tom again looked toward the rails. This time the line lay farther north on the Texas and Pacific Railway near the little town of Stanton in West Texas. Mustang Creek cut through that country and the tracks crossed it in lonely stretches of prairie dotted with mesquite and short grass. News traveled that train number 3 westbound carried express shipments worth taking. Tom decided they would repeat the trick from Stein's Pass, but now on Texas soil, where the law did not promise the gallows for every attempt. On Friday night, July 1, 1898, the gang took their positions near the creek crossing. The heat of the day still clung to the ground, but the night air cooled enough to prickle the skin. A red lantern hung in the dark near the rails, and a section of track lay ready where the passenger coaches could be cut loose. When the headlight of number 3 approached, the signal swung. The engineer saw the red warning, set his brakes, and stepped down into a ring of guns. The outlaws ordered the crew to uncouple the coaches and move the engine and express car ahead, out into the open where no surprise would ride up easily. The express messenger inside sat with his safe and a revolver, the same combination that had proved both weak and strong for other men along the line. When the train stopped and unfamiliar voices shouted outside, he understood at once what sort of trouble had found them. Any thought of putting up a serious fight had to contend with the knowledge that these men had already blown safes and beaten guards from New Mexico to Texas. Under command from the barrels pointed his way, he opened his car and stepped aside while they went to work. Again they used dynamite, packing charges against iron and stepping clear. The safe did not yield easily. The first blast bent and scorched metal, and the second tore it open enough for hands to reach in and drag out wrapped packages and loose notes. This time there was no clear idea of how much lay inside, only the solid feel of money filling sacks and the sight of smaller items they considered not worth the weight left lying on the floor. When they finished, the car stank of powder smoke and hot dust, with a jagged hole in the safe and fragments of currency scattered across the boards. In the wake of the Stanton robbery, the pattern repeated. Posses fanned out from nearby towns. Texas Rangers combed canyons and riverbeds, and deputies questioned anyone who had ridden a fresh horse or spent cash too freely. Reports came in of a group of 4 men fleeing in odd fashion. 2 in saddles, 1 on a bicycle, 1 on foot, all heavily armed. Another set of officers sifted through the hills of Tom Green County, not sure where the robbers were headed, but certain that they had roots there. Each day brought new rumors and no arrests. For Tom and his gang, the escapes blurred together into one long glide along the edges of the law's reach. By the end of that summer stretch, the gang had carved a trail of robbers' smoke from Steins Pass to Comstock to Stanton. Each stop on the rails left more fear in station houses, section camps, and cabooses. Conductors checked their watches with one eye on the darkness beyond the windows. Express messengers cleaned rifles and counted cartridges more often. The name Tom Ketchum passed between railroad men in low tones as a reminder that a man with a mask, a fuse, and a sack of dynamite might be standing outside the door at any unscheduled stop. At the same time, anger and unease worked inside the gang itself. Money eased some of that tension, but the wounds from Steins Pass, the dead man on the track, and the hard chases that followed each robbery had started to pull the men in different directions. That strain would soon push Tom further out, toward acts that even his own brother struggled to defend. July 2nd, 1899. Heat lay over the Verde River Valley into the evening, and dust still hung in the street when Tom Ketchum rode in toward the clustered buildings of Camp Verde with a revolver on his hip and tension tightening every line of his face. Camp Verde sat in a green pocket along the river where the cottonwoods cut a strip of shade through the red and tan country. The old military post had aged into a small settlement of storekeepers, farmers, freighters, and a few men who handled cattle up along the Mogollon Rim. The Wingfield and Rogers store stood near the center of that little community, a squared frame building with a porch, a wide front door, and upstairs rooms where books and ledgers were kept. Inside, there were counters loaded with dry goods, groceries, and ammunition, and a small safe that held company funds and local deposits. The owners, Mac Rogers and Clint Wingfield, divided the work. Rogers handled the front of the store most evenings, weighing out coffee beans, cutting cloth, and making small loans to customers he trusted. Wingfield spent long hours upstairs at a desk with ledgers open and ink drying on neat columns of figures. Both men were used to seeing cowboys from distant country ride in with dust on their hats and trail money in their pockets. And both were used to watching who came through the door and how they carried themselves. In the months before that July night, Tom had moved on from the train robberies and safe blasts that had tied his name to the lines in New Mexico and Texas. The gang that had held up trains at Lozier, Steins Pass, Comstock, and Stanton was finished. The strain of constant pursuit, the botched job at Steins Pass, and the pressure of living under reward posters had blown cracks through the friendships that had kept the men together. Sam Ketchum and Will Carver stayed linked to plans around Folsom and Twin Mountain. Tom drifted west and south, taking horseflesh and trail knowledge into central Arizona, away from the country where every rancher and deputy knew his face. By early summer, he was in Yavapai County, riding in and out of settlements along the Verde and the foothills above it. He had the look of a range man, dark from the sun, his clothes carrying trail dust and horse sweat. Local people saw him, traded with him, and did not ask many questions, but he did not move like a drifter looking for steady wages. He moved like a man who watched every doorway and every stranger's hand. He had killed before and gone back to camp as if it were just another part of the day's work. That history rode with him when he turned his horse toward the Wingfield and Rogers store as night closed in on Camp Verde. Lamps burned inside. Through the open door, shelves showed in yellow light stacked with flour sacks, canned goods, bolts of cloth, and boxes of ammunition. The smell of coffee and tobacco smoke mixed with the faint sweetness of dried fruit. A few local men stood, talking near the counter while Rogers finished a sale. Outside, the air held a stillness common to hot country towns at the end of a long day, when work slowed and people lingered in the one building where there was light and conversation. Tom stepped down from his horse, tied off his reins, and walked up onto the porch with a rider's loose stride that did not quite hide the way his right hand hovered close to the butt of his revolver. When he crossed the threshold, heads turned. Rogers looked up from his counter and recognition passed between the two men. Rogers had lived in Texas earlier in his life. He knew more faces than most men in that valley, and one of them now stood inside his store with eyes that did not soften. The conversation in the room died away. Tom's presence carried weight, a sense that trouble had come in with him and would not leave easily. He asked for provisions, short and flat, naming staples that any traveler would need. There was no drink in his request, no easy talk, no attempt to trade friendly words about the weather or the river. His voice stayed low, but the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders said that he was ready for resistance. Rogers turned to fill the order, but his attention kept cutting back toward the stranger at the counter. The stories that followed all agreed that something in that meeting broke any thin chance of a peaceful exchange. One moment he was behind the counter, the next he moved back toward the space where the safe and a gun lay. The motion was quick, sharper than that of a man simply reaching for a scoop or a paper sack. In that sudden rush, Tom saw a threat and answered it in the way he had answered so many others, with steel. He cleared his revolver in a single smooth motion and fired. The shot slammed into Rogers' back before the storekeeper could reach the counter end or any weapon that might have been there. Wood and glass rattled with the concussion. Rogers staggered, caught himself for a heartbeat on the edge of the counter, and then collapsed forward, knocking a scale to the floor. Blood spread fast across the boards under him, dark against the worn, pale planks. The men nearest him froze, held in place by the shock of seeing a familiar neighbor cut down without a word of warning they could hear. Upstairs, the sound of the gunshot tore through the quiet where Wingfield had been bent over account books. He pushed his chair back hard enough to scrape the floor, grabbed at the door jamb and ran down the stairs, ink still wet on his fingers. He came into the open downstairs with his chest heaving, seeing only Rogers on the floor and a stranger with a smoking gun in hand. He took another step, mouth open to demand an explanation. Tom shifted his aim and fired again. The second bullet hit Wingfield in the front as he came off the last step. The force spun him, drove him sideways into a shelf, and sent canned goods and boxes flying. He hit the floor near his partner and did not rise. Shouts erupted from the men near the door and from the street outside as people who had heard the shots pressed toward the porch and then flinched back when they saw the bodies and the gunmen. Inside the store, the air thickened with the sharp smell of burnt powder and the iron tang of blood. Rogers and Wingfield lay motionless among spilled coffee beans, scattered tins, and broken glass. Tom's face did not change. The act had been direct and efficient, without hesitation. Whatever old anger or calculation had driven him through that doorway had now spilled out in the most permanent form it could take: 2 dead men on a store floor in a small Arizona town. He backed toward the door, revolver still in hand, watching every movement around him. A man near the counter dropped his eyes and raised his hands slowly. Another edged away, hands open and empty. No one reached for a weapon. The speed and accuracy of the shooting, the way Tom held his gun steady as he moved, made it clear that any resistance would only add more bodies to the floor. When he stepped onto the porch, the street was already stirring. Men who had been sitting on hitch rails or barrel tops scattered out of his way. A few cursed him, their voices ragged with shock and hate, but none closed in. He kept the revolver visible and moved down the steps, every muscle ready for someone to be foolish or brave enough to test him. His horse stood where he had left it, reins looped loosely. He shoved the revolver back into its holster, swung into the saddle in one practiced motion, and drove his spurs in. The animal lunged forward, hooves striking sparks from a stone. Tom pointed its nose toward the river crossing, and the faint trail beyond that climbed toward the rim. Behind him, shouting rose as the people of Camp Verde finally surged fully into the open. Inside the store, townspeople rushed to Rogers and Wingfield, hands pressed against wounds that no doctor could have closed in time. Blood soaked through shirts and spread under their bodies. Men who had known the two proprietors for years, who had run tabs with them and settled accounts at harvest time, knelt in that mess of spilled goods and tried to understand how an evening that had started like any other had turned into a killing ground. Anger lit through the crowd as soon as the final flicker of hope for the two storekeepers died. Men grabbed rifles from saddle scabbards, snatched pistols from belt holsters, and called for horses. A posse pulled together in minutes, not under any formal badge or court order at first, but as a raw group of neighbors driven by the sight of two murdered men. They swung into saddles and pounded out after the fleeing rider, spurring their animals hard toward the timbered country beyond the settlement. They followed the dust cloud and the fresh tracks along the river road, but the pursuit ran more on rage than on plan. The country beyond Camp Verde cut into gullies, side draws, and ridges leading up to the plateau. A man who knew how to ride across that broken ground could vanish quickly if he chose his line well and kept moving. Tom had spent years in rougher country than this, in the canyons and badlands of New Mexico and the desert breaks of Texas. He read the land now with a cold eye, picking routes that would let him gain elevation and cover while his pursuers fought the terrain as much as they chased him. Up the slopes above the Verde, pine and juniper began to crowd the dusty draws. Rock outcrops broke the ridgelines. Tom drove his horse into that cover and kept it moving until its flanks foamed. When he finally gave it a moment's rest, he did it under thick branches where no direct line of sight ran back toward the valley. Listening, he could hear only faint echoes of shouts carried on the wind. The posse had not matched his pace or his path. He turned the horse again and pushed on, aiming for the high country route that would drop him eastward into the long corridor that led back toward New Mexico. Behind him, the men from Camp Verde rode until darkness and exhaustion forced them to slow. Their horses lathered, chests heaving, and the men themselves were breathing hard and cursing the rough ground that tore at hooves and shoes. They found sign where Tom had passed, sharp prints in soft earth at a crossing, scraped rock where steel shoes had slid on a slope, but they could not close the gap. Without a tracker equal to the best plain scouts and without fresh mounts staged ahead, their chase could not hold speed. One by one, the riders faced the fact that the man they wanted had already slipped beyond reach for the night. They turned back toward Camp Verde with nothing to show for their effort, but aching muscles and the knowledge that two bodies still lay in the store. That ride home carried a heavy silence. Men who had gone out shouting now kept their jaws clenched, staring ahead into the dark. The sense of failure mixed with awareness that they had faced an outlaw whose speed with a gun and relentless will matched the worst stories drifting in from New Mexico and Texas. Officers in Yavapai County did not let the matter drop. Formal warrants were drawn naming Tom for the killings of Mac Rogers and Clint Wingfield. Descriptions of him, complete with his height, build, dark hair, and the details that marked his face, went out along the telegraph lines and on paper notices. The name Blackjack Ketchum had already been tangled in confusion with another outlaw, but the physical description and the trail of train robberies and murders tied this man solidly to a history of violence across state lines. Tom kept moving. He knew the country across the rim and down through eastern Arizona into New Mexico, and he used that knowledge with the same cold efficiency he had shown inside the Camp Verde store. Fresh horses and weak points in the pattern of patrols and ranch watches gave him ways to slip through. He pushed his horseflesh hard, rested in hidden draws, and avoided any place where a lawman might expect him to appear. To anyone watching, he was another rider crossing remote country. To the authorities trying to catch up, he had become a wanted man for a double murder in Arizona on top of every earlier charge that already lay against him. By the time word of the Camp Verde killings reached New Mexico in full, Tom had threaded his way back into territory where he had spent much of his adult life. Around Folsom and the plains near Twin Mountain, he knew every siding, every water stop, and every gully. In that land, he also carried an even heavier weight of attention. Train robberies at Nutt, Twin Mountain, Comstock, and Stanton had already turned railroad detectives and federal marshals against him. The Liberty burglary and the killings in the Plaza Largo ambush had shown that he would not hesitate to shoot down men who tried to stand in his way. Now, with Rogers and Wingfield dead in Camp Verde, he brought into New Mexico the burden of a double murder that Arizona officers were determined not to leave unanswered. The legal tangle that grew from that July night stretched beyond the valley where the shots were fired. Arizona authorities pushed for his arrest and trial on their own soil for the killings at the Wingfield and Rogers store. New Mexico officials, once they had him in custody for a later train robbery attempt, refused to release him, arguing that stopping train holdups in their territory took priority over sending him back across the line to face judgment for the Camp Verde murders. The result left the families of Rogers and Wingfield with no chance to see him tried under Arizona law, and it fixed in public memory the image of a man whose record now held both spectacular robberies and cold-blooded shootings inside a country store. July 11, 1899. Night had settled over Folsom in the New Mexico territory when the Colorado and southern southbound slowed for the water stop and the town's few lights dimmed against the dark rim of the high plains. The train's headlamp threw a white circle along the track. Steam drifted around the tank and men on the platform watched from under hat brims while Sam Ketchum waited in the shadows with a scarf at his throat and a rifle hidden in the gloom. Folsom sat in broken country where the flats rolled out toward the Texas line and the ground lifted into the volcanic rises around Twin Mountain. The town's frame buildings hugged the rails, their fronts turned to the tracks because the railroad meant money, supplies, and the only fast line to the outside world. On this night, those rails were the center of something else, a robbery that would mark the last job Sam would ever lead and send lawmen and outlaws to die in a canyon of rock and timber southwest of Cimarron. The Colorado and Southern engine hissed and clanked at the tank, taking on water. Firebox glow flickered under the boiler. In the baggage and express car, Messenger Hamel Scott moved among crates and mail pouches, the company's strongbox locked tight against the far wall. Conductor Frank Harrington and engineer J.A. Tubbs had run this line often enough to know that train robbers haunted the country between Folsom and Des Moines, especially at the curves around Twin Mountain. They knew the stories of a masked gang that had stopped trains there before and torn open safes with explosives. Those stories crouched in the backs of their minds as a vague possibility. For Sam, they were a script he intended to repeat, but on a bigger scale. He was no longer standing behind his brother. In earlier jobs, Tom had often been the one whose name the papers printed, the one whose temper and brutality people repeated in stories from ranch to depot. On this run, Sam was the driving hand. With him were Will Carver and William Ellsworth, Elsie Lay. Both seasoned men tied at different times to the Wild Bunch and to the Hole in the Wall country. A fourth rider moved in the dark with them, his identity shifting through later accounts but his hoofprints clear enough beside theirs in the dust. Together they meant to take far more than loose cash from passengers. They wanted the express company's money, and they were ready to spill blood again to get it. When the engine finished at the tank and the train rolled out of Folsom, Sam and Lay slipped aboard the blind end of the baggage car. catching iron handholds in the dark and pulling themselves up as the cars clattered past the last lights of town. The train gathered speed along the grade. Behind, in the passenger coaches, ranchers, drummers, and families rode in the dim lamplight, unaware that armed men now crouched against the back of the express car, boots braced and bodies swaying with the motion. Farther up the line, near the S-shaped curve at Twin Mountain, Carver had built a fire beside the track where the bends wrapped around two low cones of old lava. The glow painted the ballast and rails, a sign that something was wrong ahead. As the headlamp swung through the first curve and lit that fire, Engineer Tubbs throttled down. At Carver's signal and the hard outline of a rifle barrel, he brought the train to a stop. Steam chuffed, metal squealed, and the long string of cars shuddered into stillness, surrounded by open country and looming black hillsides. Carver moved close, rifle leveled, his voice sharp and without tremor. He ordered Tubbs down from the cab and forced him and Harrington to detach the engine, mail, and express car from the passenger coaches. A few shots snapped into the night, not wild, but aimed to push men into obedience. The noise cut through the quiet and carried along the cars, stirring shouts and fear among the passengers, who now understood that they were no longer just riding a train through lonely country, but trapped in the middle of a holdup. At the blind end of the express car, Sam and Lay hammered on the door. Inside, Messenger Scott had heard the shots and ordered the door barred. Company rules said a messenger protected the safe with his life, and the man inside had no intention of opening up at the first demand. Carver strode down from the locomotive with his carbine and added his voice, promising to blow the door apart with dynamite if Scott did not yield. More shots spat against the car. They left dents in the metal skin and splinters in the wood around the frame. Under that pressure, and with Harrington and Tubbs outside under guns, Scott finally slid the bolt and cracked the door. Sam and Lay pushed in at once, revolvers drawn, faces set in the flat focus of men who had done this kind of work more than once. They ordered the messenger to stand back against the wall while they inspected the safe. It was a heavy piece of iron and steel bolted to the floor, built specifically to resist the very thing they now intended to do. Sam pulled sticks of dynamite from a saddlebag they had hauled in, set them at the door seam with a careful hand, and ran a fuse. The men cleared back into the door frame with Scott forced ahead of them. Bodies pressed against the side of the car as far from the blast as they could manage. Outside, the posse that would later track them through the mountains was not yet formed. For the moment, there were only the outlaw crew, the trainmen, and the passengers held in the rear under guard. The fuse hissed, the charge detonated, and the express car jumped under the impact. The explosion tore open the safe, buckled the roof, and threw metal fragments and splinters through the interior. Scott and the nearest men staggered from the concussion, ears ringing and lungs filled with powder smoke. Somewhere farther back, glass broke and passengers cried out. When the smoke rolled away enough for Sam to step back inside, the safe door hung at a twisted angle, its locking mechanism blown apart. Bundles of currency, coin bags, and valuable packages lay jumbled in the wreckage. They worked fast. There was no wild celebration, no wasted motion. Sam and Lay scooped up money and bundled it into grain sacks and canvas rolls. Carver kept watch at the door, rifle ready, eyes on the line of the track and the low shapes of the surrounding hills in case any rider appeared against the horizon. Within minutes, the outlaws had stripped out a heavy haul, the exact figures lost in conflicting later reports, but clearly enough to weigh down 3 horses and justify every risk taken to get it. They did not shoot any of the crew or passengers on the train. The violence they dealt out on this night took the form of the dynamite blast, pistol shots in the air, and the heavy threat of rifles pointed at backs and chests while men obeyed commands. That restraint did not make the robbery less serious in the eyes of the law. holding an entire train at gunpoint, wrecking the express company's safe, and seizing a large sum in currency and valuables, made this an outrage that demanded a strong answer from territorial officers and railroad detectives. Once the loot was loaded, the outlaws forced Tubbs to move the engine and express car forward, then left them on the line and rode off into the night, their horses' hooves thudding against the dry ground as they angled southwest toward the broken country near Cimarron. Behind them, Harrington and Scott worked to gather the shaken crew, check on the passengers, and get word out. As soon as the telegraph wires could carry the message, alerts went out up and down the line, naming the robbery location near Twin Mountain and identifying Sam Ketchum as one of the men behind it. In the hours that followed, lawmen and railroad officials gathered for a pursuit. Huerfano County Sheriff Edward J. Farr from Colorado, Special Agent William H. Reno of the Colorado and Southern, and Deputy United States Marshal Wilson. Memphis Elliott joined territorial deputies and local men who knew the ground. They armed themselves with Winchester rifles and revolvers, stocked up on ammunition, and took to the saddle. This was no loosely organized rancher posse fueled only by anger. It was a mixed group of regular officers and hardened railroad men who understood that they were hunting bandits with a record of killing lawmen. The trail led them off the high plains and into the rougher country southwest of Rayton, headed toward Turkey Creek Canyon. The outlaws had chosen that narrow cut in the hills as their hideout because timber, rock walls, and bends in the creek bed offered cover and escape routes. For years, men who wanted to vanish for a while had drifted into those canyons. Sam, Carver, and Lay counted on that same isolation to shield them while they rested their mounts and divided their plunder. As the posse rode, they studied sign in the dust and along the creek crossings. 4 sets of hoofprints, fresh and carrying the weight of loaded saddles, showed clearly at places where the trail cut through softer ground. Ashes from recent campfires, horse droppings still damp, and scraps of torn wrapping paper near a ford confirmed that the gang was ahead of them, and that they were not yet far away. The lawmen pushed their horses hard, knowing that every hour they lost meant more time for the outlaws to hide the money or slip away deeper into the hills. The first contact came when the gang still believed they were unnoticed. Deep in Turkey Creek Canyon, under high walls and scattered pines, Sam and his partners had made camp. Horses grazed near the creek. Bedrolls were unrolled close to a pool where clear water collected under a rock ledge. No lookout stood watch on the rim. Around their fire, the men moved with the loose confidence of outlaws who had pulled off a big job and believed that distance and rough terrain would work in their favor again. Moving quietly along the canyon's edge, the posse used the smoke from that fire and the echo of voices to guide them. Elliott, Farr, Reno, and their men spread out along the rim and among the rocks. When they were close enough to see individual figures below, they picked positions behind boulders and scrub. For a brief moment, the canyon held a tense stillness, the outlaws unaware, the lawmen sighting down rifle barrels at men who, hours earlier, had robbed a train and pointed guns at railroad crew and civilians. A shot cracked from the rim. Lay, who had walked down toward the creek to wash and drink, took the first bullet. The impact dropped him near the water, limbs abruptly limp on the stones. As he fell, more shots exploded from different points along the canyon edge. Shouts from the posse bounced off the rock walls, commands to surrender mixed with curses. Sam lunged for his rifle and scrambled into what little cover he could find near camp. His body, already strained by the long ride and the tension of the robbery, reacted on instinct. He worked the lever and sent rounds up toward the flashes on the rim, trying to drive the attackers back. In that exchange, a bullet from above smashed into his left upper arm, shattering bone and tearing flesh. Pain flared sharp and immediate, and the rifle slipped in his grip. The wound did not kill him, but it wrecked his ability to fight with both hands. One of the deputies in the posse, Kent Kearney from Doña Ana County, took a bullet that knocked him from his position and left him with a wound that would not heal. Another man was hit and dragged back under cover by his companions. In the canyon, Carver brought his own rifle into play from a spot above the camp where he had gone earlier. He had good elevation and a clear view of the rim in places, and he poured fire into the positions where muzzle flashes showed. His shots forced officers to flatten themselves against rocks and crawl for safer ground. The gang, battered but not yet broken, used that confusion to pull back deeper into the canyon, dragging weapons and what supplies they could reach. They could not move as quickly as before. Sam's arm hung useless and blood soaked his shirt from shoulder to elbow. Lay, hit at the water's edge, drifted in and out of consciousness, trying to crawl back toward camp whenever he could gather enough strength. The posse, shaken by their own casualties, did not press straight down into the canyon floor. They held to cover, traded sporadic fire, and waited for better angles. Over the next days, the pressure in that broken country did not ease. Kearney's wound proved mortal. He died after suffering from the damage done in that first fight, his name joining a growing list of officers who had gone out against the Ketchum crowd and not returned alive. The gang's progress slowed as they tried to move away from Turkey Creek with Sam wounded. Every mile cost them. Blood loss and shock weakened him. Infection began to start in the torn arm. Lawmen refused to let go. Sheriff Farr came back into the canyon country with renewed determination, joined again by Reno and deputies from Colfax County, including Henry Love. They followed reports from ranch hands and freighters who had seen strange riders moving through the hills, and once more they closed in near Turkey Creek on July 16. This time, both sides understood that they were sliding toward a finish. In the second clash, the posse pushed closer than before. Shots cracked back and forth among the rocks until the air over the canyon filled with smoke and the harsh echoes of rifle fire. Farr moved to a position he thought would give him a clear view into the outlaw stronghold. From there, he called for their surrender. Instead, he drew the attention of an outlaw rifleman above. A bullet struck him, cutting through his cover and into his body. The sheriff collapsed on the sloping ground, bleeding heavily. Deputy Henry Love also took a round that slammed into his thigh, driving his own knife blade into the wound and leaving him in agony. Even wounded, Carver and Lay kept firing, forcing the posse to drag their injured men back and reconsider how close they could risk coming. The canyon turned into a confined killing ground where every exposed shape drew a shot. Dust jumped from rocks, splinters flew from trunks, and the sound of men groaning in pain cut through the gunfire. By the time the shooting died down, the lawmen had paid heavily. Farr lay mortally wounded in the canyon, and Love would later die from his injuries. Other officers bore lesser wounds that would scar but not kill them. On the outlaw side, Lay carried bullet scars that would mark him for the rest of his life, and Sam's arm had been torn so badly that moving him any distance now came close to impossible. The gang slipped away in the night once more, but this time they could not travel together for long. Sam made it as far as the Lambert Ranch on Ute Creek, west of Turkey Canyon. His arm was shattered, the flesh swollen and discolored from infection. He reached the ranch house and told the cowboys there that he had been hurt in a hunting accident. They had heard nothing yet of the full details of the canyon fight. Seeing only an injured man and having no reason at that moment to connect him to a train robbery and a double lawman killing, they gave him shelter and basic care. The next day, a hand from the ranch rode into Cimarron for supplies and heard what had happened at Turkey Creek and in the pursuit. The descriptions of the wounded outlaw matched the stranger lying up at the ranch house. The hand carried that information straight to officers in town. Reno and other lawmen rode out and surrounded the Lambert place, taking no chances that Sam might still be able to fight. They entered, found him weak from blood loss and fever, and placed him under arrest without resistance. Sam was moved under guard to Santa Fe and lodged in the territorial prison. Doctors examined the wound in his arm and saw that the bone was splintered and the infection already advanced. In an attempt to save his life, they amputated the ruined limb. The surgery came late. Blood poisoning had already spread through his system. In the days that followed, he lay in his cell, feverish and in pain, watched by guards who knew he had led the last Colorado and Southern holdup near Folsom, and that his decisions in Turkey Creek Canyon had contributed to the deaths of multiple officers. On July 24, 1899, Sam Ketchum died behind those prison walls from the consequences of the gunshot that had shattered his arm and the infection that followed. His body was laid to rest in the Oddfellows Cemetery in Santa Fe. The train robbery at Twin Mountain and the running fights in Turkey Creek Canyon had taken him from the outlaw trails, ended the active leadership of the Ketchum gang, and left a trail of dead and wounded that burned his name and the name he shared with his brother even deeper into the record of violence that marked the closing years of the Old West. August 16, 1899. Heat still clung to the grasslands north of Folsom when the Colorado and Southern southbound left town and headed once more toward the curves at Twin Mountain, while a lone rider in a dark coat waited in the broken ground with a rifle and a head full of anger and stubborn pride. By that month, Tom Ketchum had become a hunted man on three fronts. New Mexico officers wanted him for train robberies and the Liberty killings. Texas papers tied his name to past depredations on their rails, and Arizona warrants named him for the Camp Verde store murders. Sam was lying in a cell at Santa Fe after Turkey Creek, missing an arm and sliding toward death. Carver and Lay had taken their own paths under other names and other leads. The gang that once moved together under his shadow no longer rode as a unit. Tom could see the walls closing in, yet the instinct that had carried him into robberies from Nut to Twin Mountain still pushed him toward the same answer, whenever money ran thin. The train that night carried passengers, mail, and express shipments along the same stretch Sam had hit in July. Crewmen knew the story in detail: the dynamite at the safe, the wrecked express car, and the lawman killed later in the canyon country. Conductor Frank Harrington in particular carried fresh memories of that earlier night, of masked men ordering him around under fire. He had no trouble remembering the Ketchum name when someone spoke it within earshot. Tom had chosen to go alone this time. There would be no partners to divide the money or argue over plans, no one to slow him down if trouble came, and no one to contradict his version of events later. He believed the train could be stopped the same way as before, with a gun, a bold stance on the tracks, and commands delivered without tremor. He ignored the fact that Sam's last run had brought a level of attention from lawmen and railroad detectives that made any repeat job on that line far more dangerous than the first one. As the locomotive pulled away from the depot lights in Folsom and began to climb toward the high ground, Tom moved his horse into position above the right-of-way. The Twin Mountain grade gave him a familiar vantage. Below, the rails curved under the hills, the ballast pale against the darker soil, telegraph poles marching beside the line. He wore a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat with a cartridge belt around his waist and a Winchester at hand. There was no fire this time, no group to build a signal or uncouple cars. When he rode down toward the track as the headlight grew larger, he did it in full view, one man against a moving train. Engineer J.A. Tubbs watched the beam reach out ahead of him through the night. As it swept around the bend, he saw a rider and a horse near the rails and the flash of a gun. Muzzle fire stabbed through the darkness, shots cracked near the cab. Tom was trying to flag the train with bullets, yelling for it to stop. His voice carried, forward through the steam and the clatter of wheels. His timing was off, his position closer to the engine than before, and the image etched into the crew's minds was not of an unknown highwayman, but of a familiar threat returning to the same ground. Harrington moved without waiting for more orders. He grabbed a shotgun kept ready in the crew's gear, stepped to a position where he could fire from the train, and watched for the rider's next move. When Tom brought his rifle up for another shot, Harrington answered with a blast from the shotgun. The heavy charge tore into Tom's right side and arm, throwing him backward. The force spun him off balance and drove him from the saddle. His horse, panicked by the gunfire and the sudden loss of weight, bolted away into the dark, reins trailing. Tom hit the ground beside the track in a spray of dirt and cinders. Pain seared through his shoulder and chest. The rifle slipped from his hand. He tried to rise, but his right arm would not obey. Blood ran through his coat and onto the ballast. The train ground to a stop. Crewmen spilled down from the cars with lanterns and weapons, scanning the scene for more attackers. They saw only the man on the ground, struggling and failing to push himself upright. They recognized him quickly. Faces that had seen wanted circulars and heard stories of the Ketchum brothers now looked down at the man who had been at the center of those tales. He lay bleeding at their feet, coat torn, one arm shredded and hanging at unnatural angles. Some of the crew pressed weapons toward him. Others, trained by long habit in railroad accidents and wrecks, knelt to staunch the flow of blood. A makeshift bandage went around his shoulder, and a tourniquet cinched down above the worst of the damage. He had gone from hunter to helpless prisoner in the space of a few staggered breaths. With no doctor in Folsom able to handle a wound that deep, the crew made a decision. They hoisted him onto the train and carried him into a car where he could lie flat. The locomotive pulled away from the scene and took him north toward Trinidad, Colorado, where surgeons and a better-equipped hospital waited. Every jolt of the car sent fresh waves of pain through his body, but the bleeding slowed enough to keep him alive through the ride. In Trinidad, doctors took one look at his ruined right arm and made their judgment. Buckshot had shattered bone and torn tissue in a way that left no hope of saving the limb. Infection would come fast if they did not act. They prepared ether, restrained him on the table, and went to work. Knives flashed under the harsh light while saw and clamps did their work. When he woke, he lay in a hospital bed with his shoulders swathed in thick bandages and nothing beyond that point except phantom pain and a stump. The outlaw whose rifle had killed men from Knickerbocker to Plaza Largo now had only one arm. Nurses and orderlies saw a gaunt, pale man with hard eyes and a set jaw, breathing through clenched teeth as he adjusted to the missing limb. Officers saw something else, a wounded prisoner who would not be able to run far or shoot fast ever again. Deputies watched the door to his room while doctors checked for fever and signs of spreading infection. He did not face only Colorado officials. New Mexico authorities had word within hours that the man believed to be behind the Twin Mountain and Folsom robberies lay in a hospital bed only a short train ride away. An agreement followed. Once the doctors declared him strong enough to travel, deputies from New Mexico came to take custody. He left Trinidad under guard, one armed and in chains, routed not back toward Arizona for Camp Verde or Texas for Comstock and Stanton, but toward the small town of Clayton on the open plains, where territorial prosecutors had decided to make a public example. Clayton sat in the northeastern corner of New Mexico territory, a wind-swept place of frame buildings, corrals, and stockyards built near cattle trails and the railroad line. The county courthouse and jail stood plain and solid, their stone and timber reserved for the business of ranch disputes, barroom fights, and occasional killings. They had never held an outlaw whose name had traveled as far as Tom Ketchum's, or who faced a statute written specifically to hang men for train robbery. The law in the book said that stopping a train by force and robbing or attempting to rob it with deadly weapons was a capital crime. It did not care whether the robber got away with $1 or nothing at all. He was indicted in Clayton for the attempted holdup near Twin Mountain on August 16th. The charge rested on the territory's anti-train robbery law. not on any of the killings that had marked his past. He entered the courtroom as a one-armed defendant in shackles, wearing prison clothes rather than range gear. Jurors saw a man they had read about in papers for years, now thinner and paler than the posters had shown, but looming in reputation over every other case on the docket. Attorneys for the defense tried to cut at the law itself. They argued that making an attempt to rob a train punishable by death violated fundamental protections, that the statute overreached by putting a failed effort in the same category as a completed murder. Judges listened, studied the text, and upheld the law. The court ruled that the territory had the right to punish train robbery with the severest penalty available, and to include attempts under that umbrella. The case went to the jury with those instructions in place. Witnesses took the stand one by one. Harrington described seeing the rider near the tracks, the exchange of shots, and the moment the shotgun blast knocked him from the saddle. Tubbs recounted the train's position and the earlier holdup in July, when Sam and his crowd had stopped his train in roughly the same place. Other members of the crew identified Tom as the wounded man they had lifted from the ballast and carried into the car. Doctors from Trinidad testified concerning the wound and the amputation, confirming that the injuries matched a close-range shotgun blast inflicted that night. Tom's past rode into that courtroom whether his lawyers liked it or not. Everyone present knew that he had been linked in press reports and wanted notices to the Nut payroll robbery, the Liberty killings, the earlier Twin Mountain raid, and the Camp Verde murders. The actual charge in Clayton concerned only the August attempt, yet the jurors could not unlearn what they had read. The sight of his missing arm and the knowledge that his brother had already died in prison after Turkey Creek only sharpened the sense that they were dealing with a man who had waged war against trains and officers across multiple territories. The verdict came back as guilty of train robbery under the statute. The judge pronounced the sentence of hanging, setting early May 1901 as the date, later adjusted to April 26th. From that moment, Tom sat in the Clayton jail as a condemned man with months remaining to watch the calendar and hear the talk that swirled outside his cell. Appeals followed the usual channels and failed. No governor's signature came to spare him or commute the sentence. Life in the small brick jail settled into a routine built on confinement and observation. A guard brought meals at regular times. The prisoner exercised in a fenced yard when allowed out, moving carefully with his one arm and staring across the open ground beyond the walls. He spoke with visiting lawyers, clergymen, and occasional reporters. Some accounts from those months described him as calm and resigned, others as surly and curt, with moments of bitter humor aimed at the law that had condemned him for a crime where no one had died and no safe had been blown. Whatever mood held him on a given day, the fact remained that the law had set an irreversible end to his life. Photographs taken during this period showed him seated, one sleeve pinned empty, hair still dark, mustache trimmed, gaze direct. The weight he had gained on prison food softened his features and thickened his body. He was no longer the lean rider who had come into Liberty or Camp Verde. The extra pounds would matter in a way few in Clayton understood once the men tasked with building the gallows measured rope and calculated the drop. The scaffold raised for his execution stood in a yard beside the jail, a tall wooden structure with steps leading up to a platform and a trapdoor cut into the floor. A stout beam overhead would carry the noose. Many in town had never watched a hanging before, much less participated in one. Local officials consulted manuals and older lawmen concerning the proper length of drop for a man of a given weight, the right thickness and type of rope, and the way to tie and place the knot so that the neck would break cleanly. Somewhere in those preparations they misjudged. The drop they set for Tom was longer than it should have been for his build and the strength of the new rope. April 26, 1901 dawned clear and cool. Word of the execution had drawn people into Clayton from miles around. Some came on horseback, others by wagon, others on the railroad that had been the scene of so many of Tom's crimes. Men, women, and children gathered near the jail yard, filling nearby roofs, fences, and rises to catch a glimpse. Officials limited attendance inside the yard itself, but the line between those who were officially there and those pressed against the boundary blurred under the strain of numbers and curiosity. Inside, guards helped Tom dress. He wore dark trousers, a shirt and jacket cleaner than the work clothes he had worn on the range and better than the prison garb of daily life. His empty sleeve hung at his side. The sheriff entered the cell, read the warrant, and asked if he had anything to say. Accounts differed on his exact reply. Some said he offered short, defiant sentences, others that he spoke quietly, acknowledging his situation without asking for mercy. What they agreed on was that he walked to the scaffold under his own power, chin level with no stumbling. The procession from cell to gallows crossed a short stretch of packed ground. On either side, men with badges and rifles watched, ready in case of some last-second attempt at rescue that had never truly been in the cards. He climbed the steps slowly, his one hand on the railing. At the top, he faced a sea of faces beyond the yard, a mass of hats and eyes turned upward toward him. Clergymen stood near the corner of the platform, praying in low voices. The sheriff and his deputies moved into position with the practiced stiffness of men who had rehearsed every motion. The hangman placed the noose around Tom's neck, the hemp rope rough against skin that had known chafing from saddle leathers and collar bands, but never anything like this. The knot came to rest just under his left ear. A black hood went over his head, cutting off the sight of sky and crowd. His ankles were bound. His wrist was tied to his body. The trap beneath his boots waited on a single lever. When the sheriff gave the signal, the lever was pulled and the trap door dropped. For a fraction of a second, gravity seized his body and rope. Instead of stopping with a sharp jerk that broke the neck, the force and the length of the drop did more. The rope snapped taut with a violent jolt. The combined weight and momentum tore his head free from his body. The hooded head dropped to the ground near the base of the scaffold while the headless body swung above, blood pouring down the stump of the neck and spraying the supports, platform, and boards below. The crowd reacted in a surge of noise. Gasps, cries, and shouts rippled outward from those nearest the scene to those on distant wagons. Men who had come expecting a grimly orderly hanging saw instead a decapitation that stained the execution yard in a way no one present would forget. Women turned away. Some fainted, others clutched children and tried to pull them back from the fence. Even hardened deputies stared in shock at the sight of the rope still taut and the body still jerking as it hung headless. Officials moved quickly to bring some order back to the yard. Doctors stepped forward, declared the man dead in the most obvious way possible, and directed that the body be cut down. Someone placed the severed head into a sack and set it aside. Others lowered the corpse onto a stretcher and carried it toward a waiting coffin. Inside, undertakers and helpers cleaned the remains as best they could, reattaching the head to the neck with cloth and pins so that the features would be visible for anyone who insisted on a last look. Photographers who had been prepared to take pictures of a hanging now had something even more sensational to capture. They posed the body after preparation, showed the scaffold stained from the botched drop, and turned those images into prints that would travel far beyond Clayton. Some of those photographs appeared on postcards sold in later years, bearing brief captions and showing the one-armed outlaw who had lost not only his freedom but, in the final instant, his head at the end of the New Mexico gallows. The execution drew criticism and dark humor in equal measure. Some said the hangman and sheriff had been careless, that they had misread tables and miscalculated the drop. Others claimed they had used an extra long fall on purpose, hoping for a spectacular end. However the mistake had come, The result humiliated officials who had wanted a demonstration of firm but orderly justice. They had instead given the territory a killing that looked more like a slaughter than a measured legal punishment. In the months and years that followed, people around the region told stories of Tom's death more often than they told precise details of the robberies and murders that had brought him to Clayton. The image that stayed in circulation was that of a one-armed, broad-shouldered man whose hanging had gone so wrong that his head had come free, a tale repeated in saloons, around ranch house tables, and in distant cities where the postcards and press reports eventually arrived. His earlier violence remained part of his history, but the manner of his end overshadowed much of it. New Mexico never again carried out a death sentence for train robbery. The combination of public revulsion at the botched execution and changing attitudes toward frontier law helped close that chapter of territorial justice. Tom's body lay in the local cemetery under a marker that carried his name but not the full weight of what he had done or how he had died. The Ketchum brothers' trail of killings, robberies, and ambushes had ended in prison for Sam, and under a gallows that failed its purpose for Tom. The legend that took shape afterward, however, fixed most sharply on that morning in Clayton when a misjudged drop turned a feared train robber into a cautionary tale, not only concerning outlawry but concerning the crude edge where frontier law and violence met.